A 6-year-old girl walks barefoot through a freezing Tennessee night, carrying a purple backpack stained with her dead mother's blood. Behind her, sirens, gunshots, and a father who would burn the world to drag her back. Ahead of her, a battered biker garage where 14 of the most dangerous men in the county sit cleaning weapons they swore they'd never use again. She pushes open that door. She whispers 6 words that will shatter every single one of them. And nothing, not the law, not the violence, not the ghosts living inside these men, will ever be the same. This is the story of how one broken little girl saved an entire outlaw brotherhood from themselves. Stay with me until the very end, because this one's gonna wreck you. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight, and let's ride. The first sound wasn't a scream. It was something worse, something quieter. A whisper that slipped through the freezing air outside a battered garage on the edge of Route 9, like a knife sliding between ribs. So soft you'd miss it if the wind shifted wrong. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in the world of men who spend their nights surrounded by diesel fumes, neon beer signs, and the slow ticking of cooling Harley engines. 14 motorcycles sat in a crooked line beneath a rusted tin awning, chrome catching the sick yellow flicker of a dying fluorescent tube, oil stains on concrete so old they'd become part of the floor itself. The cold had teeth that night. Mid-January in rural Tennessee, the kind of cold that crawls inside your jacket and sits against your bones like it owns them. Wind cut through the gaps in the garage walls and made the hanging tools sway on their hooks, a faint metallic chime that sounded almost like church bells if you were drunk enough or damaged enough to hear it that way. Inside, the Iron Vultures Motorcycle Club drifted through another sleepless night the way they always did. Boots on concrete. Cigarette smoke layered so thick it turned the overhead lights into halos. A half-empty bottle of Jim Beam sitting on an engine block next to a disassembled carburetor. Someone had left the radio on low. Some country station bleeding static between songs nobody was listening to. These weren't young men anymore. Their leather cuts carried patches earned through decades of violence, prison time, and the kind of loyalty that only forms when you've bled next to someone and watched them bleed next to you. They moved through the garage like ghosts haunting their own lives, too tired to sleep, too broken to talk, too stubborn to die. Cade Mercer sat in the far corner on a metal folding chair with one leg shorter than the others, so it rocked slightly every time he shifted his weight. Everyone called him Grim. Not because he chose the name, because it chose him. 47 years old. Face like a topographic map of bad decisions. A scar running from his left ear down to his jaw where a meth dealer caught him with a box cutter in 2011. Another one bisecting his right eyebrow from a bar fight he couldn't remember. His eyes were the color of creek water after a storm, and they carried the permanent exhaustion of a man who'd spent 6 years behind bars and come out the other side to find that the world hadn't waited for him, hadn't even noticed he was gone. He was rolling a cigarette when the door moved. Not opened. Moved, like something small pressed against the other side and pushed with everything it had, which wasn't much. The bottom of the door scraped against concrete, a sound every man in the room recognized instinctively, the way prey animals recognize a branch snapping in the dark. Hands went to waistbands, eyes went to the door. Boone, the giant former Marine everyone called Kodiak, on account of him being 6'5" and 260 pounds of scar tissue and silence, was already halfway off his stool before Grim raised one hand. The door opened 3 more inches. A bare foot appeared on the concrete. Small, pale, dirty. The toenails painted a chipped purple that was almost entirely gone now, like the last trace of something pretty that the world had been scrubbing away for days. Then the rest of her, 6 years old. Maybe. Hard to tell because she was so thin the bones in her wrists looked like they might poke through the skin. Dark hair matted against her skull, tangled with leaves, and something that might have been dried blood. Eyes too large for her face, the way children's eyes get when they've seen things no child should see. Pupils blown wide in the fluorescent light, darting from face to face to face with the frantic precision of a trapped animal calculating escape routes. She wore a thin cotton nightgown that stopped above her knees, soaked through with rain or sweat, or both, and her lips were the color of a bruise. She was clutching a purple backpack against her chest. Not carrying it, clutching it, the way you'd hold a wound closed with your hands. There was blood on the zipper. 14 men stared at her. 14 men who had collectively spent more than 40 years in various prisons, who carried enough concealed weapons to start a small war, who had buried friends and enemies and sometimes couldn't remember which was which. And not one of them moved. Not one of them breathed. The girl looked directly at Grimm. How she knew. How she picked him out of a room full of scarred, tattooed, dangerous men. That was something nobody would ever be able to explain. But she looked at him the way a compass needle finds north, like there was no other direction. Please don't let my father find me. Her voice was barely a sound. It was the ghost of a sound. It was what sound becomes when a child has been running so long and been so afraid that her body has started shutting down everything non-essential. Warmth, volume, hope, to keep the essential machinery running. Heart, lungs, legs. Grimm's cigarette hit the floor. He didn't stub it out. He didn't even notice it fall. He was off the chair and on one knee beside her before the paper finished burning, his massive frame folding down to her level with a care that surprised every man watching. His hands, scarred, calloused, tattooed across every knuckle, hovered near her shoulders without touching, like he understood instinctively that this child had been touched wrong and he would not add to that inventory. "Hey," he said. His voice came out different than anyone in the room had ever heard it. Softer, careful, like a man trying to speak to a bird that had landed on a barbed wire fence. "Hey, nobody's finding you here, okay? You're here now." The girl didn't cry. That was the thing that cracked something inside Boone's chest and made him turn his face away so nobody would see his jaw tighten. She didn't cry. 6 years old, barefoot in January, blood on her backpack, and she didn't cry. She just nodded once, a tiny mechanical movement, and said, "My mama told me to find the men with the loud motorcycles." Silence. "She said you were the good kind of monsters." Reaper, a wiry, hollow-cheeked man with a faded ranger tab tattooed on his forearm and hands that hadn't stopped trembling since Kandahar, set down his coffee mug so carefully you'd think it was made of glass. Ghost, who got his name because he never spoke unless spoken to, and sometimes not even then, pressed his back harder against the wall and closed his eyes. Deacon exhaled smoke through his nose and stared at the ceiling like it owed him something. Grimm looked at the blood on the zipper. "Where's your mama now, sweetheart?" The girl's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Something behind her eyes flickered and died the way a candle dies when someone cups their hand over it. Not blown out, just suffocated. "She's not anywhere anymore." The garage went so quiet you could hear the neon sign buzzing outside. You could hear the wind pushing against the tin roof. You could hear 14 hearts beating at different speeds, all of them too fast. Grimm reached for the backpack. The girl let him take it. Inside he found 2 things that would change everything: a bundle of recordings on a cheap digital voice recorder wrapped in a plastic bag, and a stack of handwritten financial ledgers held together with a rubber band. Names, dates, dollar amounts, police badge numbers. The scope of it unfolded in Grimm's hands like a map of hell, a violent criminal network operating across 3 counties, protected by corrupt law enforcement, trafficking drugs, and worse, through rural Tennessee, while the people paid to stop it collected envelopes and looked the other way. The girl's father ran all of it, and the girl's mother had spent the last 2 years of her life secretly documenting every transaction, every meeting, every name, building the bomb that would destroy the man she married while knowing it would probably destroy her too. "She made me practice," the girl whispered. She was looking at the floor now, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the concrete. "Running, at night. She timed me. She said when the night came I had to be fast." Grimm looked up at Boone. No words needed. Boone was already moving, the front door locked, the bay doors locked. Someone killed the exterior lights. Reaper pulled a shotgun from beneath a workbench with the fluid, practiced motion of a man who'd been reaching for weapons his entire life. "What's your name?" Grimm asked. "Ivy." "Ivy, that's a good name." He said it like he meant it, like in the middle of everything falling apart, a name still mattered. "How far did you walk?" "I don't know. Mama said follow the train tracks until I see the sign. The big bird sign. The iron vultures sign. 3 miles from the nearest house. 5 miles from the county road where the girl's father operated. A 6-year-old walked 5 miles through a January night barefoot because her dead mother trained her to. Grimm's hands were shaking. He noticed and made them stop. Boone, he said without looking up, already on it. Ghost. Perimeter. Deacon. Scanning the road. It happened like that. Quick, clean, military. These men had been broken by every institution that was supposed to hold them together. The military broke some of them. Prison broke others. Marriages, addictions, the slow grinding machinery of poverty and rage. All of it had done its work. But something in the wreckage still functioned. Something that activated when a child walked through a door carrying evidence that the world was exactly as rotten as they always knew it was. And the only people positioned to do anything about it were the ones society had already thrown away. Within 15 minutes, the compound was locked down. Floodlights mounted on the roof, originally installed to spot approaching cops during the club's less legal years, now swept the tree line in slow arcs. 2 men stationed at the gate with rifles they weren't supposed to own. Radios crackling on a frequency the police didn't monitor. The garage transformed from a place where broken men killed time into a fortress, where broken men protected something they didn't fully understand yet. Ivy sat on a workbench wrapped in Boone's jacket, which hung past her feet like a leather blanket. Reaper was in the kitchenette, burning a grilled cheese sandwich because his hands were shaking too, and he didn't know what else to do. The smell of melting butter filled the garage, a small, absurd, human smell that had no business existing alongside shotguns and criminal ledgers and a dead woman's last act of love. She won't eat anything else, Grimm said to nobody in particular. He was reading the ledgers under a lamp, and every page made the muscles in his jaw tighten further. Kid's been living on grilled cheese and water. You can see it in her arms. Boone sat on the concrete floor beside the workbench. His knees cracked when he lowered himself. He didn't say anything to Ivy. He just sat there, his back against the bench leg, his body between her and the door, a wall of flesh and scar tissue and silence that said more than any promise could. Ivy looked down at him. Are you staying? I'm staying. All night? All night? She ate half the grilled cheese, burned on one side, cold on the other. She ate it like it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. And maybe it was, because nobody had made her food without it being conditional in a very long time. Ghost came back from the perimeter check with ice in his beard and a look on his face that Grimm recognized, the look that meant something was wrong beyond the obvious. Tire tracks, Ghost said. Fresh. Quarter-mile east on the access road. Someone came up, sat for a while, turned around. How long ago? Mud still soft, within the hour. Which meant someone already knew. Someone had followed her, or tracked her, or guessed where a 6-year-old girl trained to follow train tracks would end up, when the only landmark her mother described was a sign with a big bird on it. Grimm folded the ledgers closed. He looked at Ivy, who had fallen asleep sitting upright with half a sandwich still in her hand, Boone's jacket wrapped around her like armor. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, the breathing of a child whose body was asleep but whose nervous system was still running, still listening for footsteps, still ready. We need to call the feds, Reaper said from the doorway. His voice was flat, controlled, the way it got when his training kicked in and the tremor in his hands temporarily stopped. This is bigger than us. These ledgers, this is organized crime with police protection. If we sit on this, we call the feds, they take her, Grimm said. They'll take her anyway. Not tonight they won't. Reaper stared at him. Grimm, I said not tonight. There was something in his voice that nobody argued with. Not because they were afraid of him, though some of them were, in the way you're afraid of a man who has nothing left to lose, but because they recognized what was happening. They'd all lost things. Children, wives, years, futures that evaporated before they could reach them. And here was a child who had walked through the dark to find them. Specifically, them. Not the police. Not the neighbors. Not the system that was supposed to protect her but was too busy cashing checks from the man hurting her. She came to the monsters. At 4:17 a.m. the sound came. Engines. Not Harleys. Trucks. 3 of them, coming fast up the access road with their headlights cutting through the fog like surgical instruments. They stopped at the gate in a line, and men got out. Not slowly, not carefully, but with the deliberate movements of people who were used to getting what they came for. Grim was at the front door before the first truck door closed, Boone beside him, Reaper behind them with the shotgun held low against his leg. Ghost had disappeared, which meant he was already in position somewhere nobody could see, which was exactly where Ghost was most dangerous. A man walked toward the gate through the rain that had started falling sometime in the last hour. Tall, well-dressed in a way that looked wrong for 4 a.m. on a dirt road, clean jacket, polished boots, hair combed back. He had the face of someone who smiled often and meant it never. Behind him stood 4 more men with holstered weapons they weren't bothering to conceal. "I'm looking for my daughter." His voice carried the same calm as a doctor delivering bad news. Practiced, controlled, the kind of calm that takes years of cruelty to perfect. Grim stood on the other side of the gate with rain running down his face and his hands empty at his sides. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Her name is Ivy. She's 6. She left home tonight and I'm very worried about her. I'm sure you understand." "I understand you're on private property at 4 in the morning with armed men." The father smiled. The rain made his teeth shine. "I'm just a concerned parent looking for my little girl." "And you're, what, a motorcycle club? I'm sure the sheriff would love to hear about the firearms I can see from here." "Call him." Grim didn't blink. "I'll wait." Something shifted in the father's face. The smile didn't disappear, but it changed. The way a snake's body changes direction without any visible muscle movement. Fluid. Predatory. "You don't want this fight." "Mister, I've been looking for a fight since 1998. You're welcome to be the one." For a long moment they stood there on opposite sides of the gate. The father with his money and his corrupt cops and his network of violence, Grim with his scars and his criminal record, and a garage full of men who had nothing in the world worth losing except a sleeping child wrapped in a borrowed jacket. Then headlights. More of them, coming from behind the trucks. But these weren't trucks. These were sedans, black, unmarked, moving in formation with the precision of a military convoy. Blue and red lights erupted from behind grills and dashboards. And suddenly, the access road was a carnival of sirens and floodlights, and men in FBI windbreakers stepping out with weapons drawn and voices sharp enough to cut the rain. Somebody had already called the feds. Not Grim, not Reaper. Ghost. The next 30 minutes were chaos wrapped in procedure. FBI agents swarmed the compound. The father and his men were face down in the mud with zip ties cutting into their wrists, their practiced calm replaced by the wild-eyed panic of men who finally understood that the system they'd bought and paid for had just been outbid. Agents in rain-soaked jackets carried the ledgers and recordings into evidence bags while a helicopter appeared overhead, its searchlight turning the compound into a white-hot stage. And through all of it, Ivy slept. Or pretended to sleep. Boone hadn't moved from the floor beside the workbench, and he wouldn't move until someone physically carried him away, which no one was willing to try. By 6 a.m., the father was gone. The trucks were gone. The rain was slowing to a cold drizzle that made the world look like it was dissolving at the edges. An FBI agent named Kessler, short, sharp-eyed, with the measured exhaustion of someone who'd seen this kind of operation before, stood in the garage looking at Ivy, and then at Grim, and then back at Ivy. "She needs to come with us. She just got here. She's a material witness in a federal investigation. There are protocols, Kate. She's 6. I understand that, Mr. Mercer, and I understand you want to help, but you're a convicted felon running an outlaw motorcycle club. The state isn't going to let this child stay here, and honestly, look around." Kessler gestured at the garage. The oil stains, the mounted deer skull on the wall, the lingering smell of gun oil and whiskey. "Would you leave a kid here?" Grim looked at the garage. He saw what Kessler saw. He also saw what Kessler couldn't. The half-eaten grilled cheese. Boone on the floor, Ghost standing in the rain with ice in his beard and a rifle he'd already unloaded and locked away without being asked. Reaper washing dishes in the tiny kitchenette, his trembling hands steady for the first time in months, because they had a purpose. "Yeah," Grim said. "I would." Kessler left with a card and a promise that social services would be in touch. He didn't take Ivy. Later, Grim would learn that Ghost had called the FBI tip line at 3:48 a.m. using a burner phone and given them everything: the ledgers, the recordings, the girl's location, the father's expected arrival, in a 3-minute call that was recorded as one of the most detailed civilian intelligence packages the regional field office had ever received. Ghost had spent 11 years in military intelligence before a dishonorable discharge and a drinking problem erased his career. The skills didn't erase. By 7 a.m., the compound was quiet again. Dawn came gray and reluctant, the sun refusing to commit to the day. Grim sat outside on an overturned milk crate, smoking a cigarette and watching the mist rise off the wet gravel. His boots were soaked. His back ached from the hours of standing. Inside, Ivy was finally truly asleep. Not the rigid, vigilant sleep of a hunted animal, but the deep, slack-jawed unconsciousness of a child who had decided, for reasons no adult could fully understand, that she was safe. Boone appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of black coffee. He handed one to Grim without speaking and lowered himself onto another milk crate that groaned under his weight. They sat together in the cold morning, drinking coffee that tasted like motor oil, watching the fog. "We can't keep her," Boone said. "I know. Oh, the state's going to come with paperwork and court orders, and I know. So what are we doing?" Grim took a long drag, held it, let the smoke crawl out of his lungs slowly, the way you release something you're not ready to let go of. "Right now? We're drinking coffee, and that kid in there is sleeping. That's what we're doing." Boone nodded, drank his coffee, didn't say anything else. Somewhere in the garage, Reaper was quietly washing Ivy's nightgown in the utility sink with dish soap because it was the only soap they had. Ghost was inventorying the pantry and making a list of things a 6-year-old might need, Googling it on a phone with a cracked screen. Deacon was on the roof replacing a broken floodlight bulb because Ivy had said the dark scared her. None of them had been asked to do any of it. By noon, word reached them through back channels that Ivy's father had been denied bail. The evidence? Her mother's recordings, the handwritten ledgers, Ivy's own testimony filtered through FBI child specialists, was catastrophic. Federal prosecutors were already building a RICO case that would take down not just the father, but the entire network, including 11 law enforcement officers across 3 counties who'd been on the payroll for years. The mother had been thorough, meticulous. She'd spent 2 years living inside the nightmare, mapping every corridor, documenting every monster, all while teaching her daughter how to run. She'd timed the escape routes. She'd shown Ivy the train tracks on weekend walks disguised as adventures. She'd described the Iron Vulture's sign as the big bird, so a 6-year-old could find it in the dark. And then she'd been killed. The details were still emerging, but what the FBI pieced together was simple and terrible. The father had discovered the recordings 3 days before Ivy's escape. The mother was dead within hours. But she'd anticipated this too. She'd already given Ivy the backpack, already told her when to run, already chosen the night. The last thing she'd told her daughter was this: "When I'm not here to wake you up, you wake yourself up. You take the bag, you follow the tracks, you find the bird, and you don't look back." Ivy had done exactly that. By the 3rd day, the compound had transformed in ways none of them would have predicted. It happened gradually, then all at once, the way ice melts. The collection of unlicensed firearms that lived in various hidden compartments throughout the garage began disappearing. Nobody discussed it. Nobody voted on it. Grim simply walked into the back room one morning and found Reaper dismantling the hidden gun rack behind the false wall, stacking the weapons into a duffel bag. "What are you doing?" "Kid's here," Reaper said without looking up. "Can't have this stuff lying around." "Where's it going?" "Deacon's storage unit. Off-site." Grim watched him work. Reaper's hands weren't shaking. It spread from there. The jar of cash skimmed from years of questionable transactions. The club's emergency fund, built $1 dirty at a time, got moved. Then removed entirely, donated anonymously to a veterans crisis hotline through a series of cash orders that Deacon, who'd done 2 years for money laundering, structured with the precision of a man who knew exactly how the system tracked dirty money because he'd spent years on the wrong side of it. The whiskey bottles thinned out. The ashtrays got emptied more often. Someone, nobody admitted to it, bought a box of children's Band-Aids and left them on the workbench. Someone else hung a towel over the mounted deer skull because Ivy had stared at it with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, but something worse: recognition. Like she'd seen dead things before and this one was just the latest. But the changes weren't enough. They couldn't be enough. Because the state of Tennessee didn't care about grilled cheese sandwiches and removed gun racks and Band-Aids. The state cared about paperwork and background checks and felony records and the fact that the Iron Vulture's MC was, on paper, exactly the kind of environment a child should never be placed in. The social worker arrived on day 4. Her name was Linda Oakes, and she drove a gray Honda Civic with a car seat in the back that didn't belong to any child she'd brought home. She wore sensible shoes and carried a clipboard and had the careful, measured demeanor of a woman who'd seen enough damaged children to fill a stadium and had learned to metabolize the grief the way some people metabolize alcohol. Slowly, painfully, and never completely. She walked through the garage looking at everything. The oil stains, the calendars on the wall with women on motorcycles, the cots where the men slept, the industrial coffee maker that ran 24 hours a day. And then she walked into the back room where Ivy was sitting on a makeshift bed built from shipping pallets and secondhand blankets, braiding the hair on a doll that Boone had bought from a gas station for $4.99. "Hi, sweetheart," Linda said. "I'm from a place that helps kids find safe homes." Ivy looked at her, then looked at Boone, who was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face made of stone. "I have a safe home," Ivy said. "I know you feel that way, honey. But there are families out there, real families, with bedrooms and backyards, and these are my people." Linda blinked. She looked at Grimm, who was leaning against the wall behind Boone, his expression unreadable. She looked at Ivy, who had gone back to braiding the doll's hair with the quiet focus of a child who had decided the conversation was over. "Mr. Mercer, can I speak with you outside?" They stood in the gravel lot while the wind pushed clouds across a white sky. Linda held her clipboard against her chest the way Ivy had held the backpack. Armor. "I understand what's happening here," she said. "I do. These men have formed an attachment to this child, and she to them. It happens. But you have to understand my position. I have 14 men with felony records, no child care certifications, no stable income documentation, living in a garage. I can't—" She walked 5 miles through the cold to get here. "I know. Her mother sent her here, specifically here. That woman spent 2 years planning this. She picked us." "A dying woman's desperation isn't a custody plan, Mr. Mercer." The words hit Grimm like a fist. Not because they were cruel, Linda wasn't cruel, but because they were true. And truth delivered without malice is sometimes the hardest kind to absorb. "Give me time," he said. "I can give you 72 hours. After that, I have to file for emergency placement. The judge will order her into foster care pending a custody hearing, and 72 hours. Linda nodded. She got in her gray Civic and drove away, and Grimm stood in the gravel watching her taillights disappear around the curve, and for the first time since Ivy walked through that door, he felt something worse than anger. He felt the specific leaden terror of a man who has found something worth fighting for and simultaneously realized he might not be equipped for the fight. He turned around. The entire club was standing in the garage doorway. Every one of them. 14 men lined up behind one another like a wall of leather and scars and silence. 72 hours, Grimm said. Boone's jaw tightened. Then what? Then they take her. No, Boone said. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who had held that child through 3 consecutive nights of screaming nightmares, who had learned that she liked to hold his index finger while she fell asleep because it was the only thing thick enough to feel like an anchor. They don't. Boone, I said they don't. Silence. Wind through the garage, the neon sign humming its dumb, endless song. Then, from the back of the room, Ghost's voice. Raw, unused, the voice of a man who spoke so rarely that when he did, every syllable landed like a dropped engine block. I called the FBI to save her life. I'll call every lawyer in Tennessee to save her future. Grimm looked at them. All of them. These wrecked, scarred, impossible men. And he saw something he hadn't seen in the 23 years since he'd founded this club in a parking lot behind a VA hospital with nothing but a stolen Harley and a pocket full of rage. He saw purpose. All right, he said. 72 hours. Nobody sleeps. Nobody drinks. We find a lawyer, we get the paperwork, and we figure out how 14 felons convince a Tennessee family court that a 6-year-old girl belongs in a biker garage. Reaper almost smiled. Almost. That's insane. Yeah. They'll laugh us out of the courthouse. Probably. So what's the play? Grim looked back toward the room where Ivy was still braiding a gas station doll's hair, humming something tuneless and soft, the first sound resembling music that any of them had heard come out of her. We become the men she already thinks we are. The clock started. 72 hours. And somewhere in the darkness outside the compound, past the tree line and the tire tracks and the mud, where federal agents had dragged Ivy's father face down through the rain, somewhere out there a phone was ringing. A phone that shouldn't have been ringing, because the man who owned that phone had been in federal custody for 3 days. And the voice on the other end of the line was giving instructions that no jail cell should have been able to transmit. Instructions about a girl, a backpack, and a biker garage on Route 9 that needed to burn. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. in a motel room 14 miles east of the federal detention center where Ivy's father sat behind reinforced glass with his wrists cuffed to a steel table. The man who answered wasn't in any database, wasn't on any payroll that left paper. He went by a name that changed every 6 months, but the voice on the other end of the call, routed through 3 burner phones and a contraband device smuggled inside a commissary shipment, called him Dale. The girl has a backpack, the voice said. Flat, controlled. The voice of a man who had spent decades giving orders that ended lives and had long since stopped noticing the weight of it. Inside the backpack are copies, but she also has originals that didn't make it into the FBI evidence chain. The mother was smart. She split the documents. Half went to the feds through the girl. The other half is still in that backpack. Dale sat on the edge of the motel bed and watched a water stain on the ceiling. And the girl? The girl is a problem that needs to stop being a problem. She's 6. She's a witness. She's also the only person alive who knows where her mother hid the secondary cache. 2 years of recordings. Names that aren't in the federal file yet. Names that would bring down people significantly more important than me. Dale was quiet for a long time. The motel's heating unit rattled against the wall like a dying animal. The bikers? 14 men, felony records, no legal standing. The compound is a garage on Route 9. Tin walls, no security system worth mentioning. It burns easy. And the FBI? The FBI has what they need for my case. They're not watching the girl anymore. She's a state custody matter now. Social services, paperwork. Nobody's standing guard. Dale pulled back the motel curtain and looked at the parking lot. His truck sat beneath a broken streetlight. In the bed of the truck, under a tarp, were things that made the contents of Ivy's backpack look like children's drawings. Timeline? Before the custody hearing, before she talks to anyone else, before those names get out. The line went dead. Dale sat in the dark motel room and listened to the heating unit rattle, and thought about a 6-year-old girl sleeping in a biker garage and the specific mathematics of what it would take to make that garage stop existing. 41 hours remained on the social worker's deadline. Inside the compound, nobody was sleeping. Grim sat at the long table in the garage's main bay. A piece of plywood balanced on 2 sawhorses that served as the club's meeting table, war council, card game surface, and once, an emergency operating table when Deacon took a knife to the ribs outside a bar in Knoxville. The table was covered in papers now. Legal printouts, custody law statutes, foster care regulations, emergency guardianship petitions. All of it printed at a FedEx in town by Ghost, who had driven there at midnight wearing a hoodie pulled low over his face because old habits from intelligence work don't die. They just find new missions. Reaper sat across from Grim reading a family court procedural manual he'd found online, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the legal language. His hands were trembling again. They always trembled, a souvenir from Kandahar that no medication had been able to fix. But tonight they trembled worse, and Grim noticed but said nothing because noticing was enough and mentioning it would be too much. "We need a lawyer," Reaper said without looking up. "A real one. Not a public defender. Not some guy who handles DUIs and bar fights. Someone who knows family court." "With what money?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Boone appeared from the back hallway carrying a plastic cup of water. His boots were unlaced. He'd taken to walking softly inside the compound because Ivy startled at heavy footsteps, and a 260-pound man in motorcycle boots on concrete might as well be a thunderstorm. He set the water down on the table and lowered himself into a folding chair that complained under his weight. "She had another one," he said. Grim looked up. "Nightmare?" "Worse than last night. She was screaming before she was awake, saying her mama's name over and over. Then she just stopped, like a switch flipped, sat up, stared at the wall, wouldn't speak for 10 minutes. "She say anything after?" Boone rubbed his face with both hands. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with dark circles that made him look like a man who'd aged 5 years in 4 days. "She asked me if monsters can get inside locked doors." Nobody spoke. "I told her no." "Good. I lied." Grim leaned back in his chair. The garage was cold. The heating system was a collection of space heaters that ran on hope and extension cords, and the January wind found every gap in the tin walls. Outside, the neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting rhythmic pulses of orange light through the window that made the shadows in the room expand and contract like breathing. "Where's Ghost?" "On the roof. He's been up there since 1. "Doing what?" "Watching." Grim nodded. Ghost on the roof meant Ghost had seen something, or sensed something, or simply felt the weight of threat in the air, the way certain animals feel earthquakes before they arrive. You didn't question Ghost's instincts. You just made sure you were awake when they proved right. "I found someone," Reaper said. He slid a printed page across the table. A name. An address in Nashville. A list of cases. Margaret Calloway, family court attorney, 12 years experience. She's handled contested custody cases involving non-traditional guardians, grandparents with records, former addicts, military vets with dishonorable discharges. She doesn't always win, but she fights dirty when she needs to. "How dirty?" "Dirty enough to walk into a Tennessee courthouse and argue that 14 convicted felons should raise a 6-year-old girl." Grim looked at the page. The address was 90 minutes away. Her consultation fee was listed at the bottom, a number that made his jaw tighten. "We don't have that." "I know." "We donated the emergency fund." "I know, I was there." Silence. The space heaters hummed. A gust of wind hit the tin roof and made it boom like a drum. And somewhere in the back room, Ivy made a sound in her sleep. Not a scream, just a whimper. The kind of sound that a child makes when her body is resting, but her mind is still running through dark woods, still following train tracks, still clutching a backpack that weighs more than any child should carry. Deacon walked in through the side door. He was wet, not from rain but from sweat, despite the cold. He'd been working on something outside for the past 3 hours, and he smelled like fresh sawdust and paint. "Come look at this," he said. They followed him through the side door and around the back of the garage to a section of the building that had been used for storage. Old tires, broken parts, things that were going to be fixed someday by men who never got around to it. Except now the storage was gone. The tires were gone. The broken parts were gone. In their place was a room. It was small, maybe 10 by 12. Deacon had framed it with salvaged lumber and lined the walls with drywall scraps he'd pulled from a construction dumpster 2 miles down the road. The floor was plywood, sanded smooth. There was a window. Not a real window, but a frame Deacon had built around a piece of clear acrylic, positioned to catch the morning light. He'd painted the walls a pale purple that was slightly uneven and still wet in places, and in the corner he'd built a bed frame from pine 2x4s, low to the ground, sized for a child. On the bed was a mattress. New, still in the plastic wrap. "Where'd the mattress come from?" Grim asked. Deacon didn't answer right away. He was looking at the room with the expression of a man seeing something he built and not quite believing it existed. His hands were covered in paint and sawdust, and there was a cut on his left palm where the saw had slipped, and he hadn't bothered to bandage it. "Bought it." "With what?" "Sold the Indian." He said it flat. Matter of fact. The way you'd say you sold an old jacket, but every man standing in that doorway knew what the Indian was. A 1947 Indian Chief motorcycle, Deacon's father's bike, the only thing Deacon's father had left him besides a drinking problem and a talent for violence. Deacon had spent 11 years restoring it, and it was worth more than everything else he owned combined. Grim stared at him. Deacon. It's a mattress. Kid needs a mattress. Don't make it into something. That was your father's bike. My father was a drunk who broke my mother's jaw 3 times. The bike was the only good thing that came out of knowing him, and now it's a mattress for a kid who doesn't have one. That's a better trade than anything else that bike was ever part of. He walked past them back into the garage, and nobody followed him because some things a man does alone. And grieving the last connection to a father you loved and hated in equal measure is one of them. Grim stood in the doorway of the small purple room and listened to the paint dry. It sounded like nothing. It sounded like everything. Ghost dropped down from the roof ladder at 3 a.m. with frost on his jacket and a look on his face that stopped Grim mid-step. There's a truck, Ghost said, parked on the ridge east of here, half-mile out, engine off, lights off. It's been there since midnight. Same one as before? Different. The first one was a pickup. This is a panel van, no plates. Could be nothing. Could be, but it's facing us. And the driver hasn't moved in 3 hours. You don't sit in a van on a ridge in January for 3 hours watching nothing. Grim felt something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd spent enough years in situations where violence announced itself quietly before it arrived loudly. This felt like that. This felt like the breath before the punch. Wake Boone. Tell Reaper to check the charges on the floods. And get me the binoculars. Already got them. Ghost held them up. The van has a logo on the side. Painted over, but you can see the outline under moonlight. It's a utility company logo. A fake. Nobody uses utility vans for midnight surveillance unless they're planning an approach route. Or an exit route. Ghost looked at him. Something passed between them. The silent language of men who'd both been in situations where the next 10 minutes determined whether you woke up tomorrow. You want me to go look? No, I want you here, inside the wire. Grim, if someone's planning a move on this compound, then they'll make it, and we'll be inside waiting. I'm not sending you out there blind. Ghost's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The discipline of military intelligence, the ability to subordinate instinct to chain of command even when your instincts were screaming, was still alive in him, buried under years of alcohol and disgrace, but still functional. He went inside. Grim stood alone in the cold, looking east toward a ridge he couldn't see in the darkness, thinking about a van with painted-over logos and a man who might or might not be sitting behind the wheel watching the same darkness from the other direction. He lit a cigarette. His hands were steady. They always were. That was his particular gift and his particular curse, the ability to remain perfectly calm in the presence of approaching disaster, which meant he saw everything clearly and felt everything fully and could do absolutely nothing about the gap between what he saw and what he could stop. Morning came like it didn't want to. Gray light leaking through the clouds like a wound that wouldn't close. The van on the ridge was gone. Ghost confirmed it at first light. Tire tracks in the frozen mud. A single cigarette butt on the ground. Menthol, cheap brand, the kind you buy at a gas station when you don't care about anything except staying awake. Reaper drove to Nashville at 7 a.m. to meet Margaret Calloway. He took Deacon with him because Deacon cleaned up better than most of them, tucked his tattoos under long sleeves, combed his hair back, had the kind of face that could pass for respectable if you didn't look at his hands. They wore the closest things they had to civilized clothing, which meant jeans without holes and jackets without patches. The rest of the club stayed at the compound. Grim spent the morning with Ivy, who had woken up with a fever. Not high, 100.2 on a thermometer that Boone had purchased from a pharmacy along with children's Tylenol, a thermometer, a bottle of Pedialyte, and a stuffed rabbit that he'd grabbed from the toy aisle without thinking, and then held in his massive hands at the checkout counter with an expression that dared the cashier to say one word about it. Ivy lay on her new bed in her new room with the damp purple walls and held the stuffed rabbit and stared at the ceiling with the glazed, disconnected look that children get when their bodies have finally surrendered to the accumulated trauma their minds have been holding at bay. The fever wasn't really a fever. It was her system crashing. The adrenaline that had kept her running for days, through woods, through cold, through the door of a biker garage, through armed confrontations and FBI raids and nightmares, had finally burned out. And what was left was a small, sick, exhausted child who had no more running left in her. "Tell me about the backpack," Grim said. He was sitting on the floor beside the bed, his long legs stretched out, his back against the wall. He'd been sitting there for an hour. Not pushing, just present. Ivy turned her head to look at him. "What about it?" "Your mama put a lot of stuff in there. The recordings, the papers. You carried it a long way. She said it was important." "It was. It is." Grim paused. "But she also put something else in there, didn't she?" Ivy's hand tightened on the rabbit. A micro movement. A tell that any poker player would recognize and any father would feel in his chest. "There's a pocket," Ivy said quietly. "Inside, with a different zipper." "Yeah?" "Mama said that pocket is for later. She said don't open it until I'm safe." "You're safe now, Ivy." The girl looked at him with eyes that no 6-year-old should have. Eyes that had been calibrated by violence and loss to see through the comfortable lies that adults tell children. "Am I?" Grim held her gaze. He didn't blink. He didn't offer empty reassurance. He gave her the only thing he had that was worth giving. The truth, delivered without decoration. "I don't know, but I'm going to make it so you are. And if I can't do it alone, every man in this building is going to help me. That's a promise from people who don't break promises." Ivy studied him for a long time. Then she reached under the mattress, the new mattress bought with Deacon's father's motorcycle, and pulled out the purple backpack. She unzipped the inner pocket with careful, practiced fingers, the way a child unzips something she's been told is dangerous, and pulled out a sealed envelope. On the front, in handwriting that was neat and precise and heartbreakingly steady, were 2 words. For Grim. The garage went electric. Grim held the envelope like it was made of glass. His name. Written by a dead woman. A woman he didn't know, had never met, had no connection to, and yet she'd written his name on an envelope and hidden it inside a backpack and told her daughter to deliver it to a scarred ex-con running a motorcycle club. "She knew my name?" "She knew all of you," Ivy said. "She had a book, pictures. She said she'd been watching you for a long time." Grim's blood went cold. He opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. 3 pages. Handwritten. The ink slightly smudged in places where the writer had been crying or sweating or both. And behind the letter was a photograph. Grim looked at the photograph and the world tilted. It was a picture of a woman standing outside the Iron Vulture's compound. Recent. The broken floodlight on the north corner was visible, and that had only broken 8 months ago. The woman was young, dark-haired, thin in the way that people are thin when they're not eating enough because stress has made food irrelevant. She was looking directly at the camera, or rather, directly at whoever was holding the camera, and her expression was the most complicated thing Grim had ever seen on a human face. Fear. Determination. Something that might have been trust, aimed at the compound behind her, aimed at the building and the men inside it, and the future she was constructing from impossible materials. Ivy's mother had been here, at the compound, recently. "When was this taken?" Grim asked. His voice sounded wrong to his own ears. "I don't know. Mama went out at night sometimes. When Daddy was traveling." Grim read the letter. He read it once, fast, his eyes scanning. Then he read it again, slowly, and his hands began to tremble the way they only did when something cracked the armor he'd spent 47 years welding shut. The letter explained everything. Ivy's mother, her name was Elaine, had spent 6 months researching escape options before she settled on the Iron Vultures. She'd looked into shelters, police, family services, every legitimate avenue a woman in her position should have been able to use. Every one of them was compromised. Her husband's money had poisoned every system designed to protect people like her. The shelters reported to county officials who were on the payroll. The police were the payroll. Family services was staffed by people who owed their jobs to the same political network her husband controlled. So she looked elsewhere. She looked for people the system couldn't touch because they were already outside it. She looked for men with nothing to lose, nothing to gain, and nothing to fear from the power structure that had trapped her. She found the Iron Vultures. She'd watched them for months, visited the compound at night, never entering, just watching from the tree line the way a scientist observes an ecosystem before deciding whether it's safe to introduce something fragile. She documented their patterns, who came and went, who drank and who didn't, who fought and who broke up the fights. She'd learned their names from public records and court documents. And she'd chosen Grimm, not randomly, not because he was the president, because she'd watched him carry a stray dog into the garage during a rainstorm and spend 40 minutes drying it with shop towels. Because she'd seen him stand between Reaper and a bottle of Jack Daniels one night and talk him down for 2 hours in the parking lot. Because she'd observed the way the other men orbited him, not out of fear, but out of something rare and harder to find in damaged men. Respect that had been earned, not demanded. The letter ended with a single line that Grimm read 3 times before the words stopped blurring. If you're reading this, I'm dead, and Ivy is alive because you're the man I believed you were. Now prove me right. Don't let them take her. Not the state, not the system, not anyone. She belongs with you. She always did. Grimm folded the letter, placed it on his knee, stared at the wall. Boone was standing in the doorway. He'd been there long enough to see Grimm's face change, to watch the armor crack, the jaw tighten, the eyes go wet, and then go hard again in the span of a breath. What does it say? Grimm didn't answer immediately. He looked at Ivy, who was watching him with the ancient, knowing patience of a child who has already learned that adults need time to catch up to the truths she's been carrying. It says we were never temporary. Boone's brow furrowed. She chose us, Boone, months ago. She planned all of it, the escape route, the backpack, this compound. She watched us, studied us, and she decided that 14 broken men in a garage were safer than every institution that was supposed to help her. Grimm's voice cracked on the last word. He caught it, sealed it, kept moving. She died to get Ivy here, not to a shelter, not to the FBI. Here. The weight of it settled over the room like snowfall, silent, total, the kind of weight that changes the shape of everything it touches. Boone sat down on the floor across from Grimm. 2 massive men sitting on the concrete floor of a biker garage on either side of a child's bed, the purple walls still smelling like fresh paint, a stuffed rabbit between them, and the last words of a dead woman folded on Grimm's knee. So what now? Boone asked. Now we... Grimm's phone rang. Reaper's number. He answered. Grimm. Reaper's voice was tight, controlled in the way it got when the tremor was bad and he was fighting it. We're at the lawyer's office. She'll take the case. Good. There's a problem. There's always a problem. She pulled the court docket while we were sitting here. The custody hearing's been moved up. It was supposed to be next week. It's tomorrow. What? Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Someone filed an emergency motion, a family member. Grimm's stomach dropped. Ivy doesn't have family. Her father, not her father, her father's brother. Name's Russell Mercer. Lives in Georgia. No criminal record, married, 2 kids, clean background. He filed for emergency custody 24 hours ago. I've never heard of him. Neither has anyone else. That's the problem, Grimm. This guy surfaces out of nowhere the moment the father goes down. He's a ghost. Calloway's already digging, but she says if this guy shows up tomorrow with a clean record and a 2-parent household, the judge isn't going to look twice at us. Grimm stood up, his knees cracked. Ivy was watching him, the rabbit pulled tight against her chest, her eyes tracking his face with the precise attention of a child who has learned to read adult expressions the way other children read picture books, because her survival depended on it. Grimm, Reaper continued, there's something else. Calloway found a financial connection. Russell Mercer's mortgage was paid off 8 months ago, in full, by a trust that traces back to the same network in the ledgers. Silence. He's not a rescue. He's a retrieval. Grimm looked at Ivy. Ivy looked at Grimm. And between them, in the space where the letter lay folded on his knee and the rabbit sat clutched in her thin arms, the truth landed like a dropped blade. The man coming to claim this child tomorrow wasn't family. He was an extension of the machine that killed her mother, cleaned up, dressed up, papered up, and aimed at a courtroom where 14 felons in borrowed suits wouldn't stand a chance. They had 16 hours. And somewhere on a ridge east of the compound, a panel van with painted-over logos was parked again, engine idling, headlights dark. The man behind the wheel lifted a phone to his ear and listened to a voice that said 2 words. Tomorrow night. 16 hours became 12. 12 became 9. And by the time the first gray light of morning started bleeding through the clouds over Route 9, The compound felt like a bunker waiting for an airstrike that everyone knew was coming, but nobody could see. Grim hadn't slept. He'd spent the night at the plywood table with Elaine's letter spread open in front of him, reading it again and again until the words stopped being words and became something else. A map, a confession, a last breath pressed into ink. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago. His cigarette had burned down to the filter in the ashtray without him taking a drag. Outside, the neon sign buzzed its idiot song, and the wind pushed against the tin walls with the patient, relentless pressure of something that knows it will eventually get in. Margaret Calloway arrived at 5:47 a.m. She drove a black sedan that was 15 years old but clean, and she stepped out of it carrying 2 banker's boxes full of files and wearing a suit that said she'd been awake all night too. She was 53, sharp-faced, with short gray hair and the kind of eyes that had seen enough courtroom cruelty to develop permanent armor. She didn't smile when Grim met her at the gate. She didn't offer pleasantries. She looked at the compound, looked at the men standing behind Grim in the early dark, and said, "Show me everything." They sat in the garage, Grim, Calloway, Reaper, and Boone, while the rest of the club held the perimeter and kept Ivy asleep in her purple room. Calloway spread the court documents across the plywood table and walked them through what they were facing with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing the damage before she cuts. Russell Mercer filed an emergency custody petition through a family court in Clarksville at 4 p.m. yesterday. His attorney is David Fenton, out of Atlanta. Corporate litigation, not family law, which tells me someone's paying for this and doesn't care about optics. The petition cites familial bond, stable household, 2-parent home, no criminal history. On paper, he's everything the court wants. On paper, Grim said. On paper is all that matters in a courtroom, Mr. Mercer. The judge assigned to this case is Harold Breck, 61 years old, strict constructionist. He follows the letter of the law, not the spirit, and the letter says a blood relative with a clean record takes priority over a non-relative with a felony conviction. Every time. Reaper leaned forward. What about the financial connection, the mortgage payoff? I found it. I can present it. But here's the problem. The trust that paid off Russell's mortgage is 3 layers deep in shell companies. To prove it connects to the father's criminal network, I'd need forensic accountants and subpoena power, neither of which I'll have by 9 o'clock this morning. Right now, it's a theory. Fenton will call it speculation, and Breck will agree. So we lose, Boone said. His voice was flat, emptied out. The voice of a man who'd been carrying a child through nightmares for 5 days and was now being told the nightmares might win. I didn't say that. Calloway opened her second banker's box. I said the financial angle won't be ready. That doesn't mean we go in empty. She pulled out a folder. Inside were printed records, therapist notes, school enrollment forms, medical reports. I spent the night calling in favors. A child psychologist named Dr. Susan Weeks agreed to do an emergency assessment this morning. She's driving here now. If she evaluates Ivy and finds that removal from this environment would cause significant psychological harm, we have grounds for a continuance. We don't win today, but we don't lose today either. A continuance buys us what? 30 days? Maybe 60. Enough time to trace the money. Enough time to build a real case. And Ivy stays here? Ivy stays here, pending review. Grim looked at Boone. Boone's jaw was set so tight the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. What time does the psychologist get here? 7. The hearing's at 9. That gives her 2 hours to evaluate and write a preliminary report. Calloway paused. She looked at each of them, at the scars, the tattoos, the exhaustion carved into their faces, and something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly. Recognition. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. What I'm about to say isn't an insult. It's the reality of what that courtroom will see. Say it. You are the worst possible custodians for a child in the eyes of Tennessee family law. Every single one of you. Your records, your lifestyle, the physical condition of this compound, all of it works against you. If we go to trial on the merits, we lose. If Russell Mercer is even remotely credible, we lose. Our only path is to prove that removing Ivy causes more harm than leaving her here, and to buy enough time to expose Russell as a fraud. That's it. There's no other play. The garage was quiet. Space heaters humming, wind against tin, the distant sound of ghost boots on the roof. Still watching, still waiting. "Then that's the play," Grimm said. Dr. Susan Weeks arrived at 6:52 a.m. in a Subaru with a dented fender and a child psychology degree from Vanderbilt. She was young, mid-30s, with a calm face and steady hands and the particular gentleness of someone who had chosen to spend her career sitting with damaged children because she understood that gentleness, applied correctly, could be the sharpest instrument in the room. She spent 90 minutes with Ivy, alone. Grimm didn't like it. Boone hated it. But Calloway insisted. The evaluation had to be independent, or Breck would throw it out. They waited in the garage like men waiting for a verdict. Reaper cleaned the same carburetor 3 times. Deacon stared at the wall. Boone paced. 6 steps forward, 6 steps back, a corridor of anxiety worn into the concrete. Grimm sat still and smoked and listened to the sound of his own heartbeat and tried not to think about the 100 ways this could go wrong. When Dr. Weeks emerged, her face was composed, but her eyes were red. She'd been crying. She'd wiped it away carefully, professionally, but the residue was there. A thin film of devastation that she carried out of the purple room like pollen on her clothes. "That child," she said to Calloway, her voice controlled and quiet, "has experienced complex trauma consistent with prolonged domestic violence, witnessed or suspected homicide of a primary caregiver, and extended survival-level hypervigilance. She is currently in a state of conditional attachment, bonded to specific individuals in this environment who represent safety figures. Removing her forcibly would constitute a secondary traumatic event with significant risk of dissociative episodes and long-term attachment disorder." Calloway nodded. "Will you put that in writing?" "I'll put it in writing, and I'll testify if needed. We need the report by 8:30. You'll have it by 8. She went back to her car to write. Grimm stood in the garage doorway watching her type on a laptop balanced on her steering wheel, and for one brief moment, just a flash, gone before he could hold it, he felt something that might have been hope. Thin, fragile, conditional. The kind of hope that broken men learn to distrust because it's been weaponized against them so many times. At 7:15 a.m., Ghost came down from the roof. His face was wrong. Not afraid. Ghost didn't do afraid. But something had shifted behind his eyes. A recalibration that Grimm recognized from years of reading the man's silences the way a sailor reads water. "We need to talk," Ghost said, away from the others. They walked to the far end of the parking lot, near the tree line where the gravel turned to mud and the frozen ground crunched under their boots. Ghost lit a cigarette with hands that were steady but deliberate. The steadiness of control, not calm. "I ran Russell Mercer last night," Ghost said. Deep. "Used some contacts from the old days, people who still owe me favors from when I had clearance. And? Russell Mercer doesn't exist." Grimm stared at him. "The identity is real. Social security number, driver's license, mortgage, 2 kids enrolled in a school in Marietta. But the backstory is manufactured. Before 2019, Russell Mercer is a ghost. No employment records, no tax filings, no credit history. The identity was built 5 years ago from scratch, which takes resources and expertise that a regular person doesn't have." "So who is he?" "That's what I can't find, not yet. But here's what I did find." Ghost pulled a folded printout from his jacket. Russell Mercer's wife, listed on the custody petition as co-petitioner, is named Catherine Mercer. Maiden name Catherine Boyle. The name didn't register. Grimm shook his head. Catherine Boyle was a legal secretary at Hannigan and Ross in Atlanta from 2015 to 2018. Still nothing. Hannigan and Ross was the law firm that represented Ivy's father's business interests before the federal investigation. Catherine Boyle worked directly on his accounts. The cold inside Grimm's chest wasn't the weather anymore. It was the specific, targeted cold of a trap closing around you. The sound of mechanisms clicking into place that you didn't see being built. "They built a family," Grimm said slowly. "They built a whole family. A clean identity, a wife connected to the organization, kids, probably borrowed or placed, all of it designed to pass a custody background check. It gets worse." "How does it get worse?" David Fenton, the attorney representing Russell. I pulled his client list. 3 of his clients in the last 2 years are companies owned by the same shell network that paid off Russell's mortgage. He's not a hired gun who happened to take this case. He's embedded. He's part of the infrastructure. Grimm's cigarette had burned to nothing in his hand. He hadn't felt it. So the father built a retrieval system. From inside prison, before the arrest maybe, a contingency. Elaine must have known, or suspected. That's why she didn't go through the system. She knew the system was compromised at every level, not just the cops, the legal apparatus, the family court pipeline, all of it. And she couldn't put that in the letter because if anyone intercepted it, they'd know she knew, and the contingency would accelerate. Grimm looked back at the compound. The purple room was visible through the window, a small, imperfect rectangle of pale color against the industrial gray of the garage. Inside that room, a 6-year-old girl was sitting on a mattress bought with a dead man's motorcycle, holding a stuffed rabbit, trusting 14 broken men to stand between her and an organization that had anticipated this exact scenario and built a courthouse-ready weapon to destroy it. Can Calloway use this? Not by 9 o'clock. The evidence is intelligence grade, not legal grade. It's patterns and connections, not documents with signatures. A judge like Breck won't accept it without corroboration. So we walk into that courtroom knowing Russell is a fabrication and we can't prove it. Yes. Grimm closed his eyes. The wind cut across the parking lot and made the neon sign creak on its hinges. Somewhere inside the garage, Reaper dropped a wrench and swore, and the sound was so normal, so mundane, that it felt like it belonged to a different world, one where the worst thing that could happen was a stripped bolt, not a manufactured family designed to reclaim a child for the people who killed her mother. There's one more thing, Ghost said. His voice had changed, dropped lower, quieter, the voice he used when he was about to deliver information that he knew would cause damage. Say it. I found something in Elaine's letter that you missed, or that you weren't ready to see. I read that letter 15 times. You read the words. You didn't read the names. Ghost took the letter from inside his jacket. He'd taken it from the table while Grimm was meeting with Calloway, and the fact that Grimm hadn't noticed told him exactly how rattled he was. Ghost unfolded it to the second page and pointed to a passage in the middle. She mentions watching the compound for months. She describes specific incidents she observed, the stray dog, Reaper, and the whiskey. But here, she mentions someone by name who helped her. Grimm read the passage, read it again. The words rearranged themselves in his brain like a puzzle piece snapping into a picture he didn't want to see. Someone inside the club gave her information, Ghost said. Schedules, gate codes, the radio frequency we use. She describes knowing things that you can't learn from watching through a tree line. She doesn't say who. No, she just says, one of yours believed me when I came to him. One of ours, Grimm. Someone in this club had contact with Elaine before she died. Someone knew she was planning the escape. Someone helped her, and never said a word to the rest of us. The ground shifted. Not literally, but something fundamental about the world Grimm had built. The brotherhood, the trust, the unspoken code that held 14 broken men together, cracked along a fault line he hadn't known existed. One of his brothers had known about Ivy, about the backpack, about the plan, had helped Elaine, and then stood in this garage 4 nights ago watching a barefoot girl walk through the door as if he were seeing her for the first time. Who? Grimm said. The word came out like a blade. I don't know, but whoever it is has been lying to all of us since the night she arrived. Grimm looked at the compound, at the men inside, his brothers, his family, the only people in the world he trusted without condition. One of them had a secret. One of them had looked him in the eye while he read Elaine's letter and said nothing. The trust he'd spent 23 years building suddenly felt like a house built on ice. They drove to the courthouse in a convoy that looked like a funeral procession. 7 motorcycles and 2 trucks, riding through the cold morning with exhaust plumes trailing behind them like ghosts. Grimm rode point. Boone rode beside him. The men who couldn't fit on bikes rode in Deacon's truck with Ivy buckled into a car seat that Reaper had installed at 4 a.m. with hands that shook so badly he'd stripped 2 bolts before getting it locked. Ivy was quiet. She wore new clothes, a dress that Ghost had ordered online and paid for overnight shipping, too big in the shoulders, the tag still scratching her neck. She held the stuffed rabbit in one hand and Boone's index finger in the other, and she watched the Tennessee countryside scroll past the window with the detached concentration of a child who has learned that landscapes change, but danger stays constant. Calloway met them at the courthouse steps. She looked at the bikers dismounting their Harleys in the parking lot, 14 scarred, tattooed men squeezing into suits that pulled across their shoulders and stiff shoes that made them walk like they were on unfamiliar terrain. And something flickered across her face. Not pity, not amusement, something closer to recognition. The look of a woman who had spent her career fighting for people the system had already decided to discard, and who understood that the fight itself was sometimes the only dignity available. "Russell Mercer is already inside," she said, with his wife and his attorney. "The judge is reviewing the petitions now." "What do they look like?" "Like a catalog, clean, coordinated. His wife is wearing pearls. He's got pictures of their house, their kids, the neighborhood. It's a performance, and it's a good one." Grimm looked at the courthouse doors. Ghost found something. Russell's identity was manufactured. His wife worked for the father's law firm. The whole thing is a front. Calloway's expression didn't change. She'd been a family court attorney for 12 years, and nothing surprised her anymore. Not corruption, not manufactured identities, not the lengths to which violent men would go to maintain control over the people they'd broken. "Can you prove it in the next 45 minutes? "No." "Then it doesn't exist. Not in that courtroom. Not today." She straightened her jacket. "We go with the psychologist's report. We go with Ivy's testimony if Breck will allow it. We push for a continuance. That's the play." "And if the play doesn't work?" Calloway looked at him directly. "Then the state removes Ivy from your custody today and places her with Russell Mercer pending a full hearing, and by the time we get that hearing, she'll be gone." "Gone where?" "Wherever they want to take her. Once she's in their custody, they can relocate, change schools, move states, make her inaccessible. And the secondary cache, whatever evidence Elaine hid that hasn't been found yet, disappears with her." The courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and old paper and the specific institutional despair that accumulates in buildings where families are disassembled by legal procedure. Grimm walked through it with Ivy's hand in his, and every step felt like walking through water, heavy, resistant, the current pulling against him. They filed into the courtroom. It was small, wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. A judge's bench raised on a platform that seemed designed to remind everyone below it of their diminished status. On the left side, Calloway, Grimm, Boone, Dr. Weeks, and Ivy. On the right side, David Fenton in a suit that cost more than everything in the Iron Vulture's compound combined, and beside him, Russell and Catherine Mercer. Grimm looked at Russell for the first time. The man was 40, maybe 42, medium build, clean-shaven, brown hair cut short. He wore khakis and a blue blazer and an expression of concerned warmth that was so perfectly calibrated it looked like it had been designed by committee. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. Smooth hands, uncalloused, the hands of a man who had never gripped a wrench or a rifle or a shaking child in the dark. Beside him, Catherine wore a cream blouse and small pearl earrings, and the composed, supportive expression of a woman who understood her role in this performance and was executing it flawlessly. They looked like parents. They looked like everything the system wanted for a child. They looked like a lie built with the craftsmanship of people who understood that the best lies are the ones that give the audience what they already want to believe. Judge Breck entered. He was tall and thin and moved with the economy of a man who had presided over thousands of cases and no longer wasted energy on ceremony. He sat. He opened the file. He looked at both sides with eyes that were tired but sharp. Eyes that had been lied to so many times they'd developed their own radar, though even radar has blind spots. "This is an emergency custody hearing regarding the minor child Ivy Mercer. I have 2 petitions before me. One from Mr. Cade Mercer, seeking emergency guardianship. One from Mr. Russell Mercer, seeking kinship custody. I'll hear from both sides." He looked at Fenton. "Mr. Fenton, you filed the emergency motion. Begin." Fenton stood. He was good. Grimm could see it immediately. The way he used silence, the way he modulated his voice, the way he directed the judge's attention like a conductor directing an orchestra. He presented Russell as a devoted uncle who had been estranged from his brother's criminal activities, shocked by the revelations, desperate to provide Ivy with the stable home she deserved. He presented photographs, school records for their 2 children, a letter from a pediatrician, a mortgage statement showing a 4-bedroom house in a safe neighborhood. He never mentioned how the mortgage was paid off. He never mentioned Catherine's maiden name or her former employer. He presented a surface so polished you could see your reflection in it, and the reflection showed exactly what the court wanted to see. Calloway countered with Dr. Weeks. The psychologist testified, calmly, precisely, with the authority of someone who had evaluated hundreds of traumatized children, that Ivy had formed critical attachment bonds with specific members of the Iron Vulture's MC, that removing her from this environment would constitute a secondary trauma, that the child's psychological stability, fragile as it was, depended on the continuity of these relationships. Fenton cross-examined. Dr. Weeks, you spent 90 minutes with this child. 90 minutes. And you're prepared to testify that a motorcycle club, a group of convicted felons living in a garage, provides a more suitable environment than a 2-parent household with a clean record? I'm prepared to testify that this child's nervous system has identified these specific individuals as safe. That identification didn't happen in 90 minutes. It happened over 5 days of continuous care following an acute survival event. Disrupting that bond now, in her current state, carries significant clinical risk. Clinical risk, not certainty. In child psychology, nothing is certainty, Mr. Fenton, but I've seen what happens when we prioritize paperwork over attachment, and the outcomes are rarely kind. Breck listened. His face gave nothing away. He made notes in a yellow legal pad with a pen that scratched against the paper. A sound that filled the courtroom during the silences, a metronome counting down toward a decision that would determine whether Ivy slept tonight in a purple room built by men who loved her or in a 4-bedroom house owned by people who were paid to collect her. Then Breck looked at Grimm. Mr. Mercer, I understand you're seeking emergency guardianship. You are aware of the challenges presented by your criminal record. Yes, Your Honor. 6 years incarcerated. Assault, weapons charges, no documented income, no child care certification. You live in a commercial garage. Yes, Your Honor. Give me one reason I should consider your petition over that of a blood relative with a stable household. The courtroom waited. Calloway had prepared Grimm for this moment, coached him through the night on what to say and how to say it. Stay calm. Stay factual. Don't let them see the outlaw. Show them the guardian. But Grimm didn't say what Calloway had prepared. He reached into his jacket and pulled out Elaine's letter. Because her mother chose me. Fenton objected immediately. Calloway argued for admission. Breck overruled the objection, took the letter, and read it in silence while the courtroom held its collective breath. The scratch of his pen stopped. His eyes moved across the pages. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at Grimm with an expression that had shifted. Not toward sympathy exactly, but toward something more dangerous. Curiosity. This woman, Ivy's mother, she conducted months of surveillance on your club. Yes, Your Honor. And she determined that your organization was the safest option for her daughter. Yes. Safer than law enforcement, safer than social services, safer than family. Grimm held the judge's gaze. Her husband owned law enforcement, controlled social services. And the only family presenting itself today is a man with a manufactured identity funded by the same criminal network that killed Elaine. The courtroom erupted. Fenton was on his feet. Russell Mercer's carefully composed expression cracked. Just a fraction, just for a second, but Grimm saw it. The mask slipped, and beneath it was something cold and sharp and absolutely devoid of the concerned warmth it had been projecting. Your Honor, this is slander, Fenton began. Mr. Mercer, you will provide evidence to support that claim, or I will strike it from the record and hold you in contempt. I have intelligence-grade evidence that Russell Mercer's identity was created 5 years ago, that his wife formerly worked for Ivy's father's law firm, that his mortgage was paid through a shell network connected to the criminal operation documented in Ivy's mother's ledgers, I can't prove it to legal standard today. I am asking the court for 30 days to do so. Breck looked at Fenton, looked at Russell, whose expression had recomposed itself, but whose hands, Grimm noticed, had moved from the table to his lap, hidden. Mr. Fenton, does your client wish to respond? My client categorically denies these baseless allegations. Mr. Mercer, this Mr. Mercer, is a convicted felon attempting to retain custody of a child he has no legal claim to by fabricating conspiracy theories. We ask the court to proceed with the emergency placement. Breck was quiet for a long time. He looked at the letter. He looked at Dr. Week's report. He looked at Russell Mercer, and then at Grimm, and then at Ivy, who was sitting on the bench between Boone and Calloway with the stuffed rabbit in her lap, watching everything with those ancient, damaged eyes. I'm going to grant a 30-day continuance, Breck said. Grimm's chest unlocked. But I'm also ordering an independent home study of both residences. A guardian ad litem will be appointed to represent Ivy's interests. And Mr. Mercer, he looked at Grimm, if you cannot substantiate your claims about the petitioner within 30 days, I will proceed with kinship placement. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor. Court is adjourned. They were halfway to the parking lot when it happened. Ivy stopped walking, just stopped, mid-step, in the courthouse hallway with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the floor wax smell filling the air. She was staring at something. Someone. Grimm followed her gaze down the hall to where Russell and Catherine Mercer were walking toward the exit with Fenton between them. Ivy? Boone knelt beside her. What is it? The girl's face had changed. The color, what little she had, drained out of it like water through sand. Her eyes locked on Russell Mercer's back with an intensity that made every man around her go rigid. That's not my uncle, she whispered. We know, sweetheart. We're going to... That's the man who came to our house. Her voice was shaking now, not with fear, with something older than fear, something that lived in the body before language existed to describe it. The night Mama died, he came to the door. I saw him through the stairs. Mama told me to hide, and he came inside and... She couldn't finish. Her body finished for her. A violent tremor that started in her hands and spread through her entire frame like electricity through water. Boone caught her before she fell. He scooped her up and pulled her against his chest, and her fingers dug into his jacket so hard the leather creaked. She told me to run, Ivy gasped into Boone's neck. Mama told me to run, and I heard her screaming, and I hid in the closet, and I heard... Grimm turned. Russell Mercer was at the end of the hallway, pushing through the glass doors into the daylight. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The performance was over and the mask was off, and the man walking through those doors was the man who had walked through another door on a different night and done something that a 6-year-old girl had been carrying inside her body like shrapnel ever since. Grimm. Ghost's voice. Low, urgent, close to his ear. Not here. Not now. He killed her mother. I know. And if you touch him in this courthouse, you go to prison and Ivy goes to him. That's exactly what they want. Grimm's hands were fists at his sides. Every muscle in his body was locked in the specific tension of a man using every ounce of discipline he's ever developed to keep himself from crossing a line that can't be uncrossed. The veins in his neck stood out. His jaw was grinding. His eyes were fixed on the glass doors where Russell Mercer's silhouette was dissolving into the morning light. We have 30 days, Ghost said. 30 days to prove what she just told us. To connect him. To take him down through the system instead of through our fists. The system is what got her mother killed. Then we use it better than they did. We're smarter than this, Grimm. Elaine believed that. She wrote it in the letter. Don't prove her wrong in a courthouse hallway. Grimm stood there, breathing, counting. The oldest trick he'd learned in prison. Count to 10, then count again, then keep counting until the fire behind your eyes drops below the temperature where it makes you do something you can't take back. He got to 37 before his hands unclenched. They drove back to the compound in silence. Ivy fell asleep in Boone's arms in the back of the truck, her face pressed against his chest, her breathing shallow and ragged even in unconsciousness. The rabbit had fallen to the floorboard. Nobody picked it up because nobody could let go of what they were holding. Steering wheels, door handles, the edges of their own composure. When they pulled through the gate, Ghost stopped his motorcycle at the entrance and didn't dismount. Grim pulled up beside him. "What?" "The van is back." Grim looked toward the eastern ridge. He couldn't see anything in the daylight. The tree line blocked the view, but he didn't need to see it. Ghost's eyes were enough. "Same one?" "Same position, but there's a second vehicle now, truck, parked on the west access road. They're bracketing us." Two vehicles, two directions. The compound sat between them like a nail between two hammers. "Tonight," Ghost said. It wasn't a guess. It was the assessment of a man who had spent 11 years in military intelligence reading the geometry of threat. And the geometry said that the courthouse play had failed. The 30-day continuance meant the evidence window was closing, and the people who had built Russell Mercer and killed Elaine Mercer and corrupted 3 counties of law enforcement were not the kind of people who waited for judges to make decisions when they could make their own. "Get everyone inside," Grim said. "Every gun we moved out. Bring it back." "Grim, we cleared those weapons because of Ivy. If the cops find them here during the home study, if those vehicles move on this compound tonight, a home study won't matter because there won't be a home. Bring the guns back. Now." Ghost looked at him. For 3 seconds, something passed between them that went deeper than words. The recognition that they had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. That the legal strategy, the 30-day continuance, the careful courtroom performance, all of it was happening in a world that operated on rules. And the people outside the gate didn't live in that world. They lived in the one where problems disappeared in the night, and 6-year-old girls who could identify a killer were the most dangerous kind of problem. "One more thing," Ghost said. He pulled off his glove and reached into his jacket and produced a photograph. Printed on regular paper, grainy, pulled from a security camera feed he'd accessed through channels Grim didn't want to know about. "I found out who Russell Mercer really is." Grim took the photograph. It showed a younger version of Russell, thinner, harder, with a military haircut and a uniform. The photo was from a personnel file. The name on the file wasn't Russell Mercer. It was Dale Corbett, former military contractor, discharged 2016, last known employer, a private security firm that provided asset recovery services to corporate clients. The same firm that, according to Ghost contacts, had handled 3 other cases involving witnesses in federal investigations. In each case, the witness had been relocated through legal custody channels. In each case, the witness had subsequently disappeared. Ivy wasn't just a girl they were trying to reclaim. She was a loose end they were trying to erase. Grim stared at the photograph until his vision blurred. Then he looked at the compound, at the tin walls, the purple room, the neon sign buzzing its pointless song, and understood with absolute clarity that everything was about to change. Not tomorrow, not in 30 days, tonight. He folded the photograph and put it in his pocket and looked at his brothers gathering in the garage doorway. 14 damaged, scarred, impossible men who had transformed themselves from outlaws into guardians because a dead woman believed they could, and he said the words that would end everything they'd been and begin everything they'd have to become. "Call every chapter, every brother who ever wore our patch, every man who owes us. Tell them the compound is going to be hit tonight and we're not running." He paused. "And tell them there's a little girl in a purple room who's counting on monsters to keep the real monsters out." The neon sign flickered. The wind picked up. And in the failing light of a Tennessee winter afternoon, 14 men who had spent their lives running from what they were finally stopped running and turned to face it. They came at sundown. Not all at once. That wasn't how Ghost had predicted it, and Ghost was rarely wrong about the geometry of violence. They came in stages, the way a storm builds, the way pressure accumulates behind a dam before the concrete cracks. First, the van on the eastern ridge killed its engine and went dark. Then the truck on the west access road moved forward 300 yards and stopped again. Then a third vehicle appeared on the county road to the south, headlights visible for 10 seconds before they vanished behind the tree line like eyes blinking shut. 3 positions, 3 approach vectors. A triangulation pattern that Ghost identified from the roof within 90 seconds of the first movement, his voice coming through the handheld radio with the flat, clinical precision of a man who had called in fire missions in places where getting the coordinates wrong meant your own people died. East vehicle stationary. West vehicle has advanced to the culvert, 200 meters from the gate. Third contact south, moving parallel to the fence line. They're probing. Grimm stood in the center of the garage, holding the radio in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The coffee was cold. He'd poured it 2 hours ago and hadn't taken a single sip. It was a prop, something to hold so his hands wouldn't betray the voltage running through his nervous system. Around him, the compound had transformed for the second time in a week. The first transformation had been from outlaw garage to fortress. This one was from fortress to something harder to name. A last stand. A line drawn not in sand but in blood and concrete, and the specific gravity of men who had decided that retreat was no longer a concept that applied to them. Deacon had reinforced the gate with steel cable scavenged from a construction site. Reaper had positioned the floodlights to create overlapping fields of illumination that left no blind spots within 50 meters of the building. Boone had moved Ivy's mattress from the purple room to the interior storage closet, the most protected space in the compound, surrounded by concrete block walls on 3 sides, and was sitting outside the closet door with his back against the wall and a shotgun across his knees that he'd assembled with hands that didn't shake because he'd given himself permission to stop shaking for the next 12 hours. After that, the tremors could have him back. But not now. Not tonight. The reinforcements had arrived throughout the afternoon, not an army, not even close. 7 men from a sister chapter 40 miles north, riding through the cold on machines that announced their arrival like rolling thunder. 3 more from a disbanded chapter in Kentucky, men who no longer wore the patch, but who still answered when the call came, because some loyalties outlived the organizations that created them. And 1 man who rode alone from the Virginia border, arriving at dusk on a Harley so old it looked like it belonged in a museum. His name was Merritt, and he was 71 years old, and he'd been the founding vice president of the Iron Vultures before Grimm was old enough to drive. He dismounted in the gravel lot with the slow, painful deliberation of a man whose body had stopped cooperating years ago, but whose will had not received the memo. "Heard you need bodies," Merritt said. His voice was gravel filtered through decades of whiskey and diesel exhaust. "I need people who understand what they're walking into," Grimm said. Merritt looked at the compound, at the reinforced gate, at the floodlights, at the men checking weapons and taping windows and moving with the quiet urgency of soldiers preparing a position they don't expect to leave. "I drove 4 hours to get here, Cade. Don't insult me by explaining what a fight looks like." 24 men total. Against an unknown number on the other side of the tree line with professional training, corporate funding, and the operational anonymity of people who had made witnesses disappear before and expected to do it again. Grimm gathered them in the garage. All of them. The space was crowded, bodies and leather, and the smell of gun oil and nervous sweat and the last pot of coffee Reaper had brewed before moving the machine away from the window. The neon sign outside cast its orange pulse through the glass, and in the flickering light the men's faces looked like something painted by an artist who understood that courage and terror are the same expression viewed from different angles. "Here's what we know," Grimm said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was so quiet you could hear the wind testing the tin walls. The man who filed for custody of Ivy is Dale Corbett, former military contractor. Works for a private security firm that specializes in making witnesses disappear. He killed Ivy's mother. Ivy can identify him. That makes her the only living evidence connecting him to a murder, and the people who hired him to the criminal network the feds are dismantling. He let that settle. They can't get her through the courts now. The continuance bought us 30 days, and they know that in 30 days, Ghost can trace the money, connect the identities, and blow the whole operation open. So they're going to take her the other way, tonight. Merritt spoke from the back. "How many?" Ghost counted 3 vehicles, minimum 6 operators if they're running 2 per vehicle. Could be more. These aren't amateurs. They'll have military-grade equipment and they'll move fast. Plan? We hold the compound. Ivy stays in the interior room. Nobody gets through the perimeter. And the cops? The question hung in the air like smoke. Every man in the room understood the mathematics. The corrupt sheriff's department was compromised. Calling 911 might bring help, or it might bring reinforcements for the wrong side. The FBI field office was 90 minutes away, and the men outside the tree line weren't going to wait 90 minutes. Ghost already called Kessler at the FBI field office, Grimm said. He's mobilizing a team, but they won't be here before midnight. Reaper checked his watch. It's 7:30, which means we hold for 4.5 hours. Silence. Not the silence of doubt. Grimm knew the difference. This was the silence of men doing private arithmetic, measuring what they had against what was coming and deciding whether the math worked. Some of them were calculating ammunition. Some were calculating exits. Some were calculating something more fundamental. The weight of their own lives against the weight of a 6-year-old girl sleeping in a closet who had already survived more than most of them. Boone's voice came from the hallway. He hadn't left his position outside Ivy's door. 4.5 hours. I've held positions longer than that with worse odds. You had air support, Reaper said. I had Marines. Tonight I've got something better. What's that? A reason. The word landed like a stone in water. Ripples moved through the room, thus not visible, but felt. Something shifted in the collective posture of 24 men, shoulders straightened, jaws set. The private arithmetic resolved into a single answer that didn't require calculation because it wasn't a math problem. It was a question of identity. Who are you when the worst thing you can imagine is walking toward you in the dark? They found out at 8:47 p.m. The power went out first. Not a flicker. A clean, total kill. The floodlights died. The neon sign went dark. The space heaters stopped humming. The compound dropped into blackness so complete that for 3 seconds the only light was the orange tip of Merritt's cigarette, glowing in the dark like a single defiant star. Then the generator kicked in. Reaper had wired it that afternoon. A diesel unit salvaged from a construction site, positioned inside the garage to prevent external sabotage. The floodlights surged back to life, and in the sudden white glare the perimeter was revealed in high contrast. Gravel, mud, fence line, tree line, and 2 figures moving fast along the eastern fence toward the gate. Contact east, Ghost's voice on the radio. Sharp, controlled. 2 movers, fence line, heading for the gate, armed. The next 40 minutes were the longest of Grimm's life. They didn't come through the gate. The steel cable held, and Deacon's reinforcements turned the gate into a wall that cost the first 2 operators precious seconds. Seconds that Ghost used to light them up with a handheld spotlight from the roof, while 3 brothers at the front windows shouted warnings that echoed off the tin walls and disappeared into the night. The operators fell back, regrouped. Then the van on the eastern ridge moved, not toward the gate, but around it, off-road, bouncing through the frozen field toward the north fence where the chain link was oldest and weakest. Simultaneously, the truck from the west accelerated toward the rear of the compound, its headlights cutting through the darkness like surgical blades. Coordinated. Professional. 2-axis assault designed to split the defenders and create a breach point, while the primary approach was reinforced from behind. North fence, Ghost called. Van is 50 meters out. They're going to ram it. Boone, stay on that door, Grimm said into the radio. Do not leave that door. Ain't going anywhere. The van hit the north fence at 30 miles per hour. Chain link is not designed to stop a vehicle. It's designed to stop people. And the fence folded like paper. The van plowed through, dragging 30 feet of fencing behind it, and slid to a stop on the gravel with its headlights pointed directly at the garage's north wall. Doors opened. Men got out. They moved with the disciplined efficiency of operators who had done this before, spreading to cover positions, weapons up, advancing toward the building in a formation that was textbook military. Grimm was at the north window. Beside him were 2 of the Kentucky brothers, men whose names he barely knew, but whose presence beside him felt as solid as concrete. He could see the operators in the headlight beams, 4 of them, wearing dark clothing, faces covered, moving in pairs toward the building. This is private property, Grimm shouted through the broken window. His voice carried across the gravel like a cannon shot. You are being recorded. FBI is en route. You have 30 seconds to withdraw. No response. The operators kept moving. 20 meters from the wall. 15. Then a sound from the west. The truck had reached the rear of the compound and someone was working on the back door with a breaching tool. Metal on metal. the shriek of a pry bar against a lock. "Rear breach in progress," Deacon's voice from the back hallway. Strained, winded, he was bracing the door with his body, his boots sliding on the concrete as force was applied from the other side. "I need bodies back here. Now!" Grim made a choice, the kind of choice that exists only in the space between two impossible options, the space where leaders live and die. Split his people and weaken both positions, or hold the north and lose the rear. "Reaper, take 3 men to the back. Reinforce Deacon. Everyone else holds the north." Reaper moved. 3 men followed. The compound's defense split into 2 fronts separated by 40 feet of hallway, and the specific loneliness of knowing that the men on the other front were fighting their own battle, and you couldn't help them. The north wall operators reached the building. A window shattered. Not the one Grim was at, but the adjacent one, where one of the Virginia brothers was positioned. Glass exploded inward, and in the chaos of noise and cold air, a hand reached through and grabbed the man's jacket and pulled. The brother went down. Grim was there in 2 steps, driving his elbow into the arm that had come through the window, feeling bone shift under the impact, hearing a sound from outside that was human and animal simultaneously. The arm withdrew. The brother scrambled up, bleeding from the glass, his eyes wild. "They're on the wall." "I know." At the rear, the breaching tool cracked the lock. The door burst inward and Deacon was thrown back, his boots losing traction, his body hitting the opposite wall hard enough to crack the drywall. 2 operators came through the door in fast succession, disciplined, weapons raised, scanning. Reaper was waiting, not with a gun, with a fire extinguisher. He discharged it directly into the first operator's face, a blast of white chemical fog that turned the hallway into a cloud of choking powder and confusion. The operator stumbled. The second one collided with the first, and in that 3-second window of chaos, Reaper and the 3 men behind him hit them with everything they had. Fists, boots, the fire extinguisher itself swung like a mace. It was brutal. It was ugly. It was nothing like the movies. Real violence between trained men in a confined space is short and savage and incredibly loud. And when it's over, everyone involved is bleeding and no one is sure who won until the bodies stop moving and you count who's still standing. Reaper was still standing. Barely. His nose was broken. He could feel the cartilage shifted sideways, could taste the blood running down the back of his throat. One of the Kentucky brothers was on the floor with a gash above his eye that was bleeding freely. But the 2 operators were down, zip-tied with cable from the garage, breathing, but done. "Back door secure," Reaper said into the radio. His voice sounded like he was talking through a wet towel. At the north wall, Grim's situation was deteriorating. The remaining operators had pulled back from the building but hadn't retreated. They'd repositioned, using the van as cover, and were systematically targeting the floodlights. One by one, the lights exploded in showers of sparks and glass, and with each one the darkness crept closer, reclaiming territory that had been bought with electricity and desperation. 3 lights left, then 2, then 1. "Ghost, I need eyes." "I've got them." 4 operators behind the van. They're waiting for the lights to go. Once it's dark, they'll rush the north wall. "Can you stop them?" "I can slow them down." The last floodlight exploded. Darkness dropped over the compound like a black curtain, and in the 3 seconds before Ghost activated the backup, a set of truck-mounted spotlights he'd rigged on the roof as a contingency, the operators moved. Fast. 2 toward the broken window, 2 toward the garage bay door. Ghost hit the spotlights. The compound lit up in harsh, uneven light. Not the clean coverage of the floods, but a jagged, shadow-heavy illumination that turned the gravel lot into a landscape of angles and darkness. In that light, the operators were exposed for 1 second. Just one. Merritt, 71 years old, former vice president, 4 hours on a motorcycle in the cold, stepped out of the side door with a hunting rifle he'd carried across his back since Virginia. He didn't aim through a scope. He didn't calculate windage. He fired once into the ground 2 feet in front of the lead operator, and the crack of the rifle was so loud it echoed off the tree line and came back like an answer. The operators stopped, froze. The shot had been precise, close enough to feel the impact of displaced gravel, far enough to be a warning rather than a wound. "Next one goes higher," Merritt called out. His voice was steady, 71 years old and steady. "Your call, boys." Standoff, the operators behind the van, Merritt in the doorway, Grim at the window, Ghost on the roof. 24 men scattered through a battered garage around a closet where a 6-year-old girl was curled on a mattress with a stuffed rabbit pressed against her ears to block out the sounds of the world trying to get in. The standoff held for 11 minutes. It felt like 11 years. 11. Grim could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel sweat running down his spine despite the cold, could smell the chemical residue from Reaper's fire extinguisher drifting through the hallway like ghost smoke. His knuckles were raw from the window fight. Blood ran from a cut on his forearm that he didn't remember receiving. Beside him, the Virginia brother was pressing his jacket against his glass wounds and breathing through his teeth. Then, the sound that changed everything. Sirens. Distant but unmistakable. Not one. Many. The kind of sound that only a full federal mobilization makes. A wall of noise rolling across the Tennessee countryside like weather. The operators heard it too. Grim saw the shift. The way their body language changed from offensive to assessment, from assault to calculation. The mathematics of the situation had just changed. They'd come here expecting to breach, extract, and disappear before anyone responded. They hadn't expected 24 men. They hadn't expected a rifle shot from a 71-year-old man in the doorway. And they definitely hadn't expected the FBI to arrive 90 minutes ahead of schedule. The van's engine started. The operators pulled back, fast, disciplined, even in retreat. They loaded into the van through the hole in the north fence and accelerated across the frozen field, taillights bouncing over the uneven ground. The truck on the west side was already gone. Grim heard its engine fade into the distance before the first FBI vehicle crested the ridge. They were pulling out. All of them. The triangulation collapsing inward, the vehicles converging on a single exit route that Ghost tracked from the roof until the taillights disappeared into the darkness beyond the tree line. "They're running," Ghost radioed. "All 3 vehicles heading northeast on the county road. Fast." Grim leaned against the wall. His legs felt like they were made of something less reliable than bone. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the last hour was draining out of his system with a velocity that made the room swim. He could hear Reaper in the back hallway, coughing through his broken nose. He could hear Deacon groaning as someone helped him off the floor. He could hear the Kentucky brother with the gashed forehead telling someone he was fine. "Just get him a towel, he's fine." He could hear the sirens getting louder. And then, from the closet, from behind the door where Boone had sat for 4.5 hours without moving, without eating, without doing anything except being a wall between a child and the world, a small voice. "Is it over?" Boone looked at the door. He looked at Grim, who had come down the hallway and was leaning in the doorframe with blood on his arm and glass dust in his hair, and an expression that was simultaneously the most exhausted and the most alive thing Boone had ever seen on a human face. "Yeah, Ivy, it's over." The door opened. She stood there in the doorway of the closet, small, pale, clutching the rabbit with one hand and the doorframe with the other, her eyes adjusting to the light. She looked at Boone. She looked at Grim. She looked down the hallway at Reaper, who was sitting against the wall with blood running from his broken nose and a fire extinguisher lying beside him like a fallen weapon. She walked to Reaper first. Not to Grim. Not to Boone. To the man with the trembling hands and the broken nose who had burned her grilled cheese sandwiches at midnight and never asked for anything in return. She stood in front of him and looked at his face. The blood, the swelling, the crooked angle of his nose, and her lower lip trembled. "Does it hurt?" Reaper looked up at her. His eyes were wet. Not from the pain. "Nah, I've had worse." "Liar." He almost laughed. Almost. What came out instead was a sound that lived somewhere between a laugh and a sob and a cough. And it hurt his broken nose so badly that tears streamed down his face, and Ivy reached out with her small hand and placed it against his cheek, gently, so gently, the way you touch something precious and damaged, and said, "Thank you for staying." Reaper's hands stopped trembling. For the first time in 4 years since the night in Kandahar that had broken something inside him that every medication and therapist and bottle of whiskey had failed to reach. His hands went completely still. He looked at them, at his own hands, steady and quiet in his lap, and he stared at them like a man seeing a miracle he'd stopped believing in. The FBI arrived 7 minutes later. Kessler led the team, 40 agents in tactical gear, who swept the compound and the surrounding area with the efficient devastation of a force that arrives too late and knows it. They found the breach in the north fence. They found the 2 zip-tied operators in the back hallway, who were already lawyering up with the desperate urgency of men who understood that their employers would not be sending rescue. They found shell casings. They found tire tracks. They found the breaching tools. And they found 24 men standing in a battered garage around a 6-year-old girl who was holding a stuffed rabbit and the hand of a man whose nose would never be straight again. Kessler looked at the scene, looked at the blood on the floor, looked at the broken windows and the chemical residue, and the old man with the hunting rifle sitting on an overturned bucket smoking a cigarette as if he'd just finished mowing the lawn. "Anyone want to tell me what happened?" Grimm stepped forward. He was running on nothing. No sleep, no food, no adrenaline. Just the specific, stubborn fuel of a man who has decided that he will stay standing until the last thing that needs doing is done. "Dale Corbett," he said. "That's Russell Mercer's real name, former military contractor. He killed Ivy's mother. Ivy can identify him. He came here tonight to eliminate the witness." "You have evidence?" Ghost descended from the roof ladder. He was carrying a laptop and a folder, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this exact question for 6 hours. "I have 11 years of intelligence training and everything I've compiled since Tuesday. Financial traces connecting Corbett to the father's criminal network, employment records from the security firm, a pattern of witness elimination across 3 federal cases. And," he opened the laptop, "47 minutes of video footage I recorded from the roof tonight showing armed men breaching this compound, which I'm prepared to transmit to your field office right now." Kessler stared at him. "You recorded it." "I record everything. It's a personality flaw." Kessler took the laptop. He looked at the footage. He looked at Ghost. He looked at Grimm, who was swaying slightly on his feet, and at Ivy, who was watching the FBI agents with the wary patience of a child who had learned that uniforms didn't automatically mean safety. "Dale Corbett," Kessler said into his radio, "former alias Russell Mercer, federal warrant, fled the area heading northeast approximately 15 minutes ago. 3 vehicles. Consider armed and extremely dangerous." The radio crackled with responses. Units mobilizing, roadblocks setting up. The machinery of federal law enforcement engaging with the slow, grinding, relentless power of a system that, for once, was pointed in the right direction. Grimm sat down on the concrete floor. He didn't choose to sit. His body chose for him. His legs simply stopped working, and the floor rose to meet him with the cold, hard honesty of concrete. He sat there with his back against the wall and his bloody arm in his lap and his eyes closed, listening to the sirens and the radios and the voices and the sound of Ivy telling Reaper he should put ice on his nose, because that's what her mama used to do when something hurt. Boone lowered himself down beside Grimm. His knees cracked. His back ached. Every part of him that could hurt. "Hey. Hey. We did it." Grimm opened his eyes. He looked at the compound, the broken windows, the chemical haze, the blood, the glass, the hole in the north fence where a van had rammed through like a fist through paper. He looked at his brothers, bleeding, exhausted, sitting and standing and leaning against walls like men who'd been picked up by a storm and set down hard. "Not yet," Grimm said. "What do you mean?" "They haven't caught Corbett. Until they catch him, Ivy's not safe. Until a judge sees the evidence and rules in our favor, Ivy's not ours. Until this is finished, really finished, not just tonight's version of finished, we're still in the fight." Boone was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You remember what you told us? Back when this started? You said we need to become the men she already thinks we are." "Yeah, I think we just did." Grimm looked across the garage to where Ivy was now sitting on Reaper's lap, carefully placing a Band-Aid across the bridge of his broken nose while he held perfectly still and his steady, tremor-free hands rested on his knees like things he'd just discovered belonged to him. "Not yet," Grimm said again, softer this time. "But we're closer." At 11:42 p.m., Kessler's phone rang. He answered, listened for 30 seconds, and crossed the garage to where Grimm was still sitting on the floor because standing required energy he no longer possessed. State police picked up 2 of the 3 vehicles at a roadblock near the Kentucky border. 6 men in custody. But the third vehicle, a dark sedan, broke through the roadblock heading north. 1 occupant. Corbett. We think so. State police are in pursuit. FBI helicopter is en route. He's running, but we'll get him. The net's closing. Grimm looked at Ivy. She had fallen asleep in Reaper's arms. Finally, completely, the deep unconscious sleep of a child who had been carried through violence by men who would rather break than bend, who would rather bleed than let go. Reaper was holding her with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man handling something infinitely more valuable than anything he'd ever been trusted with before. His hands were still steady. His eyes were open. He was watching the door. Outside, the night was full of sirens and searchlights and the sound of a helicopter somewhere in the distance, hunting through the dark for a man who had killed a mother and come for her child and discovered that the space between him and that child was filled with 14 scarred, broken, impossible men who had decided, quietly, without speeches, without ceremony, that this was the hill. Not the hill they'd chosen, the hill that had chosen them. And somewhere on a dark Tennessee highway, a sedan was racing north through the night with its headlights off, and the man behind the wheel was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. And in his rear-view mirror the blue and red lights were multiplying like stars being born. 1, then 3, then 7, then too many to count. And the net was closing, and the road was narrowing, and the last man standing between Ivy Mercer and the rest of her life was running out of road. Dale Corbett ran out of road at 2:13 a.m. on a stretch of highway 17 miles south of the Kentucky border where the asphalt curved hard against a limestone bluff and the guardrail had been broken since a logging truck missed the turn in 2019. The state police pursuit had been relentless. 7 cruisers in formation behind him, the FBI helicopter overhead painting the road in white light, spike strips deployed at 2 points that Corbett had swerved around with the desperate precision of a man who understood that stopping meant the rest of his life in a cell. He didn't stop. He accelerated into the curve at 94 miles per hour, and the sedan's tires lost traction on the frozen asphalt, and the car went through the broken guardrail sideways, and for 3 seconds Dale Corbett was airborne over a 60-foot drop into a ravine choked with dead timber and January ice. He survived. That was the cruel mathematics of it. The car hit the tree line nose first, and the impact crushed the engine block into the dashboard, but the airbags deployed and the trees absorbed enough energy to keep the crash from being instantly fatal. State troopers rappelled down the bluff and found him pinned behind the steering wheel with both legs broken and a punctured lung, and the specific, furious consciousness of a man who was still trying to reach for the weapon on his hip, even as his body was failing him. They cut him out of the car at 3:47 a.m., airlifted him to a trauma center in Nashville. He was in surgery by 5. By 7, federal marshals were stationed outside his room, and the FBI had begun the process of dismantling the identity of Russell Mercer and rebuilding the identity of Dale Corbett, former military contractor, suspected in the murder of Elaine Mercer, architect of an attempted armed assault on a civilian compound, and the man who had walked through a door on a winter night and done something to a young mother that her 6-year-old daughter had been carrying in her body like a buried bomb ever since. Grimm got the call at 4:22 a.m. He was still sitting on the garage floor. He hadn't moved in 5 hours. His arm had stopped bleeding on its own. The cut wasn't deep, just messy, and Deacon had wrapped it with electrical tape and a shop towel that was already soaked through. The phone buzzed against his thigh, and he answered it with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. Kessler's voice. Tired. Professional. But underneath the professionalism, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. Corbett is in federal custody. Alive. He's not going anywhere. Grimm closed his eyes. The information entered him the way water enters dry ground. Slowly, soaking through layers of exhaustion and tension and fear that had compacted over days into something nearly geological. He didn't feel relief. Relief is what you feel when a problem is solved, What Grimm felt was closer to the sensation of setting down a weight you've carried so long, your body has forgotten what it feels like to stand upright without it. Grimm? You there? I'm here. We're going to need Ivy's testimony when she's ready. There's no rush. We have physical evidence, the video footage from your man on the roof, and 2 of Corbett's operators are already cooperating. But her identification is the keystone. She saw him the night her mother was killed. I know. But there are child advocacy specialists who can handle the interview. It doesn't have to be a courtroom. Not yet. Okay. And Grimm, the custody petition filed by Russell Mercer is going to be vacated. Fenton, the attorney, is being investigated for his role in the network. The judge will be informed this morning. As far as the family court is concerned, the only petition still active is yours. Grimm opened his eyes. He looked across the garage to where Ivy was sleeping in Reaper's arms, the band-aid she'd placed across his broken nose slightly crooked, her fingers still curled around the stuffed rabbit, her face slack with the total surrender of a child who had finally stopped listening for footsteps. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank the man on your roof with 11 years of intelligence training and a personality flaw. The line went dead. Grimm lowered the phone to his lap and sat there in the quiet of the garage. The aftermath quiet. The silence that comes after violence and sirens and helicopter rotors and breaking glass. The silence that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something unnamed, something that moves into the spaces where chaos used to be and fills them with a stillness so heavy you can feel it pressing against your skin. Boone was watching him. Well? They got him. Boone exhaled. It was the longest, slowest breath Grimm had ever heard a man take, as if Boone had been holding it since the night Ivy walked through the door and was only now, 6 days later, allowing his lungs to fully release. His massive frame seemed to shrink by an inch as the air left him. His eyes closed, his hands, resting on his knees, unclenched. Tell the others, Grimm said. In a minute. Boone. In a minute, Grimm. Just let me sit here for a minute. Grimm let him sit. They sat together on the cold concrete floor of a battered garage with broken windows and chemical residue and blood and glass and the smell of diesel and coffee, and the faint, almost imaginary scent of purple paint coming from a room down the hall that a man had built for a child using scrap wood and money from a motorcycle he'd loved and hated in equal measure. The news moved through the compound the way warmth moves through a frozen building, slowly, room by room, man by man. Ghost came down from the roof for the last time and sat on the ladder's bottom rung and put his head in his hands and was still for so long that Deacon walked over to check if he was breathing. He was. He was just being still, and for Ghost, stillness was the closest thing to celebration he knew. Merritt stubbed out his cigarette on the bottom of his boot and nodded once and said, "Good." And that was all. Because 71 years had taught him that the most important things in life require the fewest words. Reaper didn't move. Couldn't move. Ivy was asleep on his chest, and his arms had locked around her with the involuntary permanence of a man whose body had made a decision his mind hadn't been consulted on. His hands were still steady. He looked at them periodically, at the absence of tremor, at the calm in his own fingers, with an expression of bewildered gratitude, like a man who had been told his whole life that a wound was permanent and was now watching it close. Dawn came. It came the way Tennessee dawns do in January, reluctant, gray, the light seeping through the clouds like something being released against its will. It touched the compound with the indifferent gentleness of a world that doesn't know or care what happened in the dark, but offers morning anyway to everyone, without condition. The broken windows let the light in at angles the intact ones didn't, and by 7 a.m., the garage was illuminated in a way it had never been before. Raw, exposed, every stain and scar and crack visible under a sky that was slowly, grudgingly, turning blue. The FBI cleared out by 8. Evidence teams had photographed everything. The 2 captured operators had been transported. Kessler shook Grimm's hand in the gravel lot, and his handshake was different from the first one. Firmer, longer, the handshake of a man who had reclassified the person in front of him. "The home study," Grimm said. "The one the judge ordered. It's going to find broken windows, a hole in the fence, and chemical residue in the hallway. Kessler looked at the compound. I'll talk to the judge. I'll explain what happened here and why it happened. That compound isn't a liability, Mr. Mercer. It's evidence of what these men are willing to endure to protect a child. Any judge who can't see that doesn't deserve the bench. He drove away. The last federal vehicle disappeared around the curve, and for the first time in 6 days, the compound was silent. Truly silent. No sirens, no radios, no helicopter, no strangers with badges asking questions, just the wind and the birds coming back to the trees they'd fled from during the night, and the sound of 14 men breathing in a space that had been a garage and a fortress and a battlefield and was now, somehow, becoming a home. Grimm walked to the purple room. The door was open. The morning light came through the acrylic window Deacon had installed and landed on the pale purple walls in a rectangle of white gold that moved slowly across the surface as the sun climbed. The bed was undisturbed. Ivy had been in the closet all night, and the mattress still held the shape of her last sleep, a small depression in the center where her body had been. He sat on the edge of the bed. The wood frame creaked under his weight. He ran his hand across the blanket. A cheap thing, purchased at a dollar store, washed twice in the utility sink with dish soap because it was the only soap they had. He picked up the pillow and held it, and it smelled like the specific combination of sweat and soap and something else. Something he couldn't name but recognized, because it was the smell of childhood, the smell of a small body that runs hot even in winter, the smell that parents learn to identify without thinking and that non-parents never encounter unless life arranges it for them in unexpected ways. He put the pillow down. He took Elaine's letter from his pocket, wrinkled now, blood-spotted, the ink slightly smeared from sweat and rain and the general abuse of being carried through a siege. He unfolded it and read the last line again. She belongs with you. She always did. He folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand. A wooden crate turned on its side that Deacon had sanded smooth and fitted with a small shelf inside. The letter would stay there, in Ivy's room, where it belonged. The weeks that followed were not a montage. They were not quick or easy or scored with hopeful music. They were slow, hard, and full of the specific unglamorous labor that real transformation requires. The kind of work that doesn't make for good cinema because it consists mainly of paperwork, phone calls, waiting rooms, and the quiet, grinding process of men rebuilding themselves from the inside out. Ghost assembled the intelligence package that Margaret Calloway needed. 3 weeks of 18-hour days, burning through contacts and databases, and the dwindling favors of former colleagues who had once trusted him before his discharge, and his drinking and his disappearance from the world of clearances and classified briefings. He traced the money. He connected the identities. He built a paper trail that ran from Dale Corbett's security firm through 4 shell companies to the criminal network documented in Elaine's ledgers, and he presented it to Calloway in a 3-inch binder that she later described to a colleague as the most thorough piece of civilian intelligence work she'd ever seen. Corbett was charged with first-degree murder 4 weeks after his arrest. The evidence was comprehensive. Ivy's identification, corroborated by physical evidence recovered from the Mercer home, testimony from the cooperating operators, and a digital forensics analysis of the burner phones used to coordinate the compound assault. The network Elaine had spent 2 years documenting unraveled in the federal courts like a sweater pulled from a single thread. 17 indictments, 11 law enforcement officers arrested, 3 county officials removed. The corruption that had imprisoned Elaine and silenced every legitimate avenue of help she'd tried to access was gutted, name by name, charge by charge, in a series of hearings that dominated the Tennessee news cycle for months. Ivy testified once, in a closed room with a child advocacy specialist and a camera and no audience except the people the law required. She spoke for 47 minutes. She described the night her mother died, not in the language of trauma, which is fragmentary and chaotic, but in the language of a child who had been given time and safety and the steady presence of damaged men who understood that healing doesn't happen on a schedule. She described the man at the door. She described hiding in the closet. She described the sounds. And when it was over, she walked out of the room and found Boone waiting in the hallway, and she held up her arms and he lifted her, and she buried her face in his neck and was still. The custody hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in March, when the Tennessee winter had finally loosened its grip and the first green was appearing on the trees like a rumor the landscape wasn't sure it believed yet. Calloway had built a case that was less a legal argument than a monument, constructed from Dr. Week's comprehensive psychological evaluation, testimony from Ivy's teachers at the school the club had enrolled her in, statements from the FBI confirming the men's cooperation in a federal investigation, and the documented transformation of the compound from an outlaw garage to a functional, if unconventional, home. 14 men walked into the courthouse. They wore the same stiff suits they'd worn the first time, pulled tight across their shoulders, too short in the sleeves, the kind of suits that broadcast their discomfort to everyone in the room. But something was different. Not the suits. The men inside them. They walked differently. Not with the guarded tension of outlaws entering hostile territory, but with the deliberate calm of men who had earned the right to be there and knew it. Reaper's hands were steady. Ghost's eyes were clear. Boone moved through the courthouse hallway with Ivy on his hip, and the people who saw them, the clerks, the attorneys, the other families waiting for their own hearings, didn't see a felon carrying a child. They saw a father. Judge Breck had read the entire file, every page. Grimm could tell by the way he looked at them, not with the guarded neutrality of a judge evaluating strangers, but with the complicated expression of a man who had been forced to revise a conclusion he'd been comfortable with and who was honest enough to admit it. "I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both the petitioner and the guardian ad litem," Breck said. "I've reviewed the FBI's report on the events of January 19th. I've reviewed the home study conducted by the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, which I will note describes significant improvements to the residential facility since the initial assessment." He paused. He looked at Ivy, who was sitting between Boone and Grimm in the front row, her feet not reaching the floor, the stuffed rabbit in her lap. "And I've reviewed the psychological evaluation of the minor child, which describes a degree of attachment, trust, and emotional recovery that Dr. Weeks characterizes as, and I'm quoting, remarkable given the severity of the child's trauma history and directly attributable to the consistent protective care provided by her current guardians." The courtroom was quiet. The petition filed by the individual known as Russell Mercer has been vacated due to criminal charges. The only active petition is that of Mr. Cade Mercer, seeking permanent legal guardianship. Breck removed his glasses. He cleaned them with a handkerchief. He put them back on. These were the gestures of a man buying himself time, not because he was unsure of his decision, but because he understood the weight of it and wanted to honor that weight before he set it down. This court has seen many unconventional custody arrangements. I have placed children with grandparents, with family friends, with distant relatives, with foster families of every configuration. But I have never seen a case where a dying mother conducted months of investigation to identify the specific individuals she trusted with her daughter's life, and where those individuals subsequently defended that child against an armed assault while cooperating fully with federal law enforcement. He looked at Grimm. "Mr. Mercer, your criminal record is not erased by these events. Your past is your past. But this court is tasked with determining what serves the best interests of this child, and it is the finding of this court that the best interests of Ivy Mercer are served by granting permanent legal guardianship to Cade Mercer, effective immediately." The sound that followed was not cheering, it was not applause. It was something quieter and more devastating. The collective exhalation of 14 men who had been holding their breath for 73 days, released simultaneously in a sound that was part relief and part grief and part something that doesn't have a word in English, because it describes the feeling of broken men discovering that they are capable of building something that lasts. Ivy didn't react at first. She sat very still, the way she'd sat still on the first night, with the ancient, watchful patience of a child who has learned not to trust good news until it proves itself. Then she looked at Grimm, then at Boone. Then she turned around in her seat and looked at the row behind her, where 12 more men sat in their terrible suits with their scarred hands and their wet eyes and their absolute, unwavering silence. She slid off the bench. She walked to Reaper, who was sitting at the end of the row with his hands folded in his lap. Steady, still, the tremor that had defined him for 4 years absent as completely as if it had never existed. She climbed into his lap without asking permission, the way children do when they have decided that a person belongs to them, and she put her arms around his neck and held on. Reaper broke. Silently, completely, the way a dam breaks when the water has been pressing against it for years, and the final molecule tips the balance. Tears ran down his face and over the crooked bridge of his nose. Still crooked, never properly set, a permanent record of the night he'd fought for her with a fire extinguisher in his bare hands. And he held her with his steady hands and pressed his face into her hair and said nothing because there was nothing to say that his body wasn't already saying. One by one, the others came. Boone, Ghost, Deacon. Merritt, who had driven 4 hours from Virginia and had come back for the hearing without being asked. They gathered around Reaper and Ivy in the courtroom aisle like a formation. Not military, not organized, just the instinctive geometry of people drawing close to the thing that matters most. Grimm stood apart for a moment. He watched them. These men he'd spent 23 years leading through darkness, through violence, through the slow erosion of purpose that comes from living outside a society that never wanted you. He watched them circle a child like a wall of leather and scars and imperfect love, and he felt something shift inside him. Not break, not heal. Shift. The way tectonic plates shift. Slow, permanent, irreversible. Then Ivy looked up from Reaper's shoulder and found his eyes across the aisle and said, "Come here." He came. The months that followed were the quietest the Iron Vulture's compound had ever known. Not silent. The place was never silent, not with 14 men and a growing child and the constant low-grade chaos of a life being assembled from spare parts. But quiet in the way that a place becomes quiet when the people inside it have stopped running from something and started building toward something else. The compound changed. Not all at once. In increments. The tin walls got insulated. The broken windows were replaced. The neon sign stayed. Ivy loved it, loved the way it made the gravel lot glow orange at night, loved standing in the doorway after dinner watching it flicker while the men worked on motorcycles behind her, and the smell of oil and coffee and the cold Tennessee night moved through the garage like weather. The men changed too. Ghost stopped drinking. Not through any dramatic intervention. He simply didn't pick up the bottle one evening, and then he didn't pick it up the next evening, and after a while the absence of it became its own kind of presence, a space in his life that filled with other things. Clarity, sleep, the ability to sit with Ivy at the kitchen table and help her with math homework using skills he'd developed for calculating artillery trajectories, repurposed now for fractions and word problems. Boone enrolled in an EMT certification course at the community college 20 miles south. He drove there 3 evenings a week on his Harley, and the other students, most of them 20 years younger, learned quickly that the giant scarred man in the back row asked the best questions and took the most careful notes and had a way of staying calm during the practical exercises that made everyone else in the room feel calmer too. When they asked why he'd enrolled, he said, "Somebody told me I was good at keeping people alive. Figured I should get a certificate for it." Deacon built things. That was his transformation. The discovery that the hands he'd used for violence were equally capable of creation, and that the latter left him less empty at the end of the day. He built bookshelves for Ivy's room, a desk for her homework, a bench for the front of the compound where the men sat in the evenings drinking coffee and watching the sky. He built a swing set from salvaged lumber and heavy-gauge chain, and he tested it by sitting in the swing himself, all 220 pounds of him, rocking back and forth in the gravel while Ivy stood on the porch laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. Reaper's hands never trembled again. Dr. Weeks, who continued to see Ivy weekly and who had developed a quiet professional respect for the men she'd initially viewed with clinical skepticism, offered an explanation once. She said that sometimes a traumatized nervous system heals not through therapy or medication, but through purpose, through the body discovering a reason to be steady that is more powerful than the reason it learned to shake. Reaper listened and nodded and didn't say anything, because he already knew. He'd known since the night a 6-year-old girl placed her hand on his cheek and said, "Thank you for staying," and his hands had answered by doing the one thing they'd been unable to do for 4 years. Grimm started the foundation on a Saturday morning in April, sitting at the plywood table with a laptop Ghost had configured, and a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once. He called it Bravehearts, and its mission was simple: provide protection, transportation, and support for abused children in the Tennessee child welfare system. The model was built on the only thing the Iron Vultures had ever been good at, showing up. When a child was being moved from an unsafe home, the bikers escorted the transport vehicle. When a child had a court date, they lined the courthouse steps. When a child was afraid of the dark, of the noise, of the specific and terrible vulnerability of being small in a world that had already proven it could hurt you, the bikers were there. Large, scarred, loud, dangerous looking in every way that mattered, and safe in every way that counted. The first escort was a 7-year-old boy being transferred from an abusive foster placement to a vetted family 40 miles away. 8 Harleys rode in formation around the social worker's sedan, engines thundering through the rural Tennessee morning, chrome catching the spring sunlight. The boy pressed his face against the car window and watched the motorcycles with wide eyes. And when they arrived at the new home, he asked the social worker if the motorcycle men would come back. "If you need them," she said, "they always come back. Summer." The compound in the long light of a June evening. Ivy is 8 now, 2 years since the night she walked through the door, and she is changed in the way that all survivors are changed, which is to say she carries the past inside her like a room she can enter but no longer lives in. She is fierce. She is compassionate. She is funny in ways that catch the men off guard and make them laugh at moments when they didn't know they were capable of laughing. She calls Grim by his real name, Cade, when they're alone, and Grim in front of the others, because she understands that names carry different weights in different rooms, and she respects the architecture of the world these men built. She has her mother's strength, not the desperate, cornered strength of Elaine's final years, but something older and more durable, the strength that comes from being loved without condition by imperfect people who show up every single day regardless of what the day contains. On quiet evenings, Grim sits on the bench Deacon built and drinks his coffee and watches the compound come alive with the sounds of a life he never expected to have. Ivy's laughter. Boone quizzing himself on EMT protocols at the picnic table. Ghost teaching Ivy chess with the patient intensity of a man who has discovered that the best use of a strategic mind is helping a child learn to think 3 moves ahead. Reaper in the kitchen, the same kitchenette where he burned grilled cheese sandwiches at midnight, cooking actual meals now, following recipes he finds online, his steady hands moving through the work with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has learned that feeding people is its own form of protection. The Harleys still line up beneath the tin awning, the engine still cool with that slow metallic ticking that sounds like a heartbeat winding down. The neon sign still buzzes its orange song into the night, and the Iron Vultures logo, that big bird that a dying woman described to her daughter as a landmark, a destination, a promise, still glows above the gate like a beacon for anyone lost enough, desperate enough, brave enough to follow the train tracks through the dark. One evening, as the sun drops below the tree line and the compound settles into the blue-gray quiet of a Tennessee dusk, Ivy comes outside and sits beside Grim on the bench. She's holding a book, homework probably, or one of the novels Ghost has been feeding her from a used bookstore in town. She doesn't open it. She just sits beside him, close enough that her shoulder touches his arm, and they watch the sky do what the sky does at the end of every day, regardless of what happened beneath it. "Cade?" "Yeah." "Do you think Mama can see us?" He is quiet for a long time. Not because he doesn't have an answer, but because the answer matters too much to deliver carelessly. "I think what your mama did, the plan, the backpack, the letter, I think she put so much of herself into getting you here that part of her is here. In this place. In these walls. In every single one of us." He paused. "I don't know what happens after, Ivy, but I know she's in you every time you're brave, every time you're kind, every time you laugh at something Reaper cooks that shouldn't be funny but is. That's her." Ivy leans against his arm. The book sits closed in her lap. The neon sign comes on. It's on a timer now, one of Ghost's improvements, and the compound floods with its familiar orange glow. "Cade?" "Yeah. I'm glad I found the bird." He puts his arm around her. It's an imperfect gesture from an imperfect man. Too heavy, slightly awkward, the arm of someone who spent most of his life using his arms for things other than tenderness and is still learning the mechanics of it. But Ivy leans into it, and it holds, and the weight of it feels right. The scars never vanish, the memories never fade. The men who ride those Harleys will carry their damage for the rest of their lives. The prison years, the combat ghosts, the addictions and the losses and the long catalog of things they did and things that were done to them. That doesn't change. That was never going to change. But in the middle of all the smoke, leather, thunder, and broken souls, in a battered compound off Route 9 where a neon bird flickers against the Tennessee night, something impossible survives. Not because it was easy, not because anyone deserved it, but because a mother loved her daughter enough to plan the impossible, and a daughter was brave enough to walk through the dark, and 14 broken men were strong enough to become the monsters that keep the real monsters away. A family built by outlaws, saved by one little girl carrying a backpack full of truth, and held together, night after night, year after year, by the rough, imperfect, unbreakable love of men who finally found something worth protecting more than their own pain. The engine's cool, the neon hums, and somewhere in the garage a man with steady hands is cooking dinner for a girl who changed everything, and the smell of it drifts through the compound like a promise that the world, for all its darkness, still has warm rooms and full plates, and people who will sit beside you in the quiet and stay.